How are we going, everyone? Welcome to this live stream, the latest episode of the multiple podcast conversations we're having on the Global Gambit right now. It's Wednesday, 8th April, 6 o'clock, just about to turn 6 o'clock here in London. So 1 o'clock if you're in eastern coast of the US, or 7 o'clock if you're in Europe, and another equivalent time somewhere else in the world. But I'm not going to go through every single time zone. We've got quite a lot to cover this time around. The ceasefire looks to be very fragile, on the precipice of potentially breaking. And we're obviously going to get into whose fault is that, if anyone's, what is actually the prospects of it holding. Is this to do with Iran? Is it to do with the Strait of Hormuz? Is it around Lebanon? Now, as I've said from the beginning, we're going to be having some great guests joining. We're starting off with Samantha Gross, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. She looks at energy and climate related, but I wanted to get her take on the Strait and obviously energy security around the Strait of Hormuz. And then we're going to be joined later on by Amir and David of the FDD. We'll break further into those momentarily, but we are joined by Samantha, so I'm very excited to hear what she has to say. Things are moving quickly, so we're going to try and keep it as up to date as we can. But let's see what Samantha has to say. Hello, Samantha. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. It's lovely to meet you. I think this is our first time interacting online,
Yes.
and I mean, goodness me, there is a lot here to talk about right now. We've got the Strait of Hormuz seemingly being reclosed, if it was ever closed, or reopened. Obviously, the fog of war around that. Lebanon is a big flashpoint right now, and a lot of concerns around the ceasefire holding. So I think just diving straight into it, really, you've been very active on this from different angles. And when you look at what's happened in the past 24, 36, 48 hours, what have you mainly been focusing on? What are your biggest concerns right now?
So my biggest concern since the ceasefire was announced is, will it hold? Is this a good step on the road to more good things, or is this temporary, or is it not even real? It looks to me like the US and Iran are coming at it from slightly different angles. I'm not sure they're viewing this the same way. And it also feels like we've really given something to Iran in terms of this ceasefire. We are fully admitting that Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. We are asking them to open it. We're giving them something for opening it, whereas that was not the case before this war started. And so those are the things that are really front of my mind right now.
I mute myself because we had a noise in the background. Now, you're Director of Energy Security and Climate at Brookings, and one of the biggest concerns about all of this is the consistent provision and access to energy coming through the Strait. Now, I think the biggest sticking point through this, hopefully these negotiations that will start again on Friday, is around the Strait of Hormuz. I think that's going to be the biggest point of difference between the two. So can you take us through a little bit what you think either side is really thinking about this, be that from the United States in Washington where you are, but also from the Tehran and regime, government, whatever side?
Yeah, let's start with the Iranian side first. Iran cannot beat the US and Israel militarily, clearly. But it does have some really important weapons to engage in this conflict. The most important one is the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil and 20% of the world's LNG typically go through it. And so blocking the Strait of Hormuz is a serious economic weapon that Iran can use, even though it has a hard time defeating the US and Israel together militarily. So, I mean, I believe that Iran is going to continue to use the Strait as leverage for as long as it feels it needs to. On the US side, this is really interesting. I believe some things that are a bit different than what's coming out of the administration right now. I've heard President Trump say that we don't need to worry about the Strait of Hormuz. It's not about us, because our oil doesn't come from there. And I think the thing that he misses is that oil is priced on a global market. we're seeing things things aren't equilibrated for the disruption that's happening right now. But at some point, this flows into oil prices everywhere. It doesn't matter whether or not we get our oil through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is important for the United States and every other country in the world because oil prices are set globally. So you've got a bit of an asymmetric thing. Clearly, the US and Israel win militarily, but Iran has some serious cards to play, and they are certainly playing them.
But there seems to have been a deliberate mismatch. There was a lot of argumentation on the internet yesterday about whether the agreement was based on Trump's 15 points plan or Iran's 10-point proposal. And the Iranians' subsequent 10-point proposal was quite, I think, deliberately vague. If you read the 10 points, especially around the Strait of Hormuz, it's around full passage access and also developing some kind of securitized system around there. But, you know, as the day has gone on now, there have been subsequent claims that the Trump has said that he agrees with the idea of a toll, or that the Americans and the Iranians are working together on some kind of toll. Do you have any, particular thoughts on that? Any additional information I might have missed?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I'm catching information at the same time as you do, so I don't have any particular insight on the particulars of that negotiation. But I want to focus on the differences between, say, February 27th and now. Right. On February 27th, before the conflict started, there was free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. It wasn't controlled by any country. You have Iranian territory on one side and Omani territory on the other side, that little spit that Oman has. And there's free navigation through the strait. Well, what we're talking about now is cutting a deal with Iran. We're bargaining over establishing navigation through that strait. We're admitting that Iran owns it. And we're talking about the potential for a toll on a natural waterway. I mean, it makes sense to have tolls on, the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal, because, they're man-made entities that need maintenance and running and all of that. But we're talking about Iran charging a toll for a body of water that it just sits on one side of. So we're agreeing that they control it by thinking about giving them a toll. And the other thing that we're doing that really strikes me as a bit crazy is think of the revenue that Iran will get from that toll. I mean, nothing is certain yet, but I've heard numbers of a couple $1 million per tanker or ship. I've heard $1 a barrel described. Those are kind of the same order of magnitude. This is a serious source of revenue for Iran. So we've gone in, we've destroyed all these programs. We don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. We don't want them to have a missiles program. But suddenly we're going to set up a big new source of revenue for them? I find that completely shocking.
But isn't it the case that the Iranians have been earning double the amount of money during this conflict that they were before February 27th, right? They're literally earning a hell of a load of income, which is going to be used to rebuild what is clearly a system that still functions. The press conference by Hegseth and General Kane earlier today, I think, was pretty clear. Trump had three main military objectives: destroy the Iranian ballistic missile and drone program, destroy the Iranian Navy, and destroy their defense industrial capacity. Well, we've had continuous drone and missile exchanges. I think they started within the first hour that the ceasefire agreement was set. So clearly the ceasefire is being violated, and clearly Iran is going to continue to close the strait. So they're going to continue to benefit from this either way, if they get a toll in a hypothetical arrangement, or if they just pay, forcing the payment of ships that want to traverse it. Or what's your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you're saying. I mean, you talk about the three goals that Secretary Hegseth and the president have set. Okay, we've largely achieved those goals, but completely wiping out, particularly the drone program, it's really difficult to do. I mean, those are not complicated pieces of military equipment. You can assemble those in somebody's basement. How are we going to wipe out every basement in which drones could be assembled? The missile program may be a little bit easier, but it's not like Iran didn't know something like this could happen. Those are quite distributed, and it's not just big missiles. I mean, the F-15 that went down in Iran last Friday, was taken down by a shoulder-fired missile. Are we going to be able to eliminate all of those? I mean, completely eliminating Iran's weapons program is an extremely difficult thing to do. And then you think of what we've given up in this conflict. We've de facto given Iran control of one of the most important trade choke points in the world. I mean, it really, like, okay, we've set back their weapons program, but I mean, if things go as they're looking right now, we've also set up a new revenue program for them to get it all back. And you're talking about the increased revenues that Iran has been generating. I was also shocked when we lifted sanctions on Iranian oil that was on the water. Part of the reason why they're making so much more money off of their oil is they had to sell it at a discount when it was sanctioned. You know, they're selling it to refineries that are willing to take it on the down low. Whereas if it's unsanctioned, they can sell it at the market price. And the higher market price has happened because of the war. And so I see things we're doing just working at cross purposes, and it doesn't make a ton of sense to me.
But couldn't you argue that it doesn't really matter for the United States, right? You've worked in the US Department of Energy in your previous roles. So you're aware of the growth in energy independence, you could say, or autonomy that the American economy has benefited from. Part of the argument people claim about Europe is that America has been providing as an alternative to Russian energy, American energy, and therefore it was, part of people claim the deep state, all that sort of stuff, that this was a ploy by America to force Europe to be more reliant on America. No, I'm not surprised, but more my point is simply, for Trump it doesn't really matter, right? He gets some money from the toll booth.
Well, let's think about this for a minute. I mean, you hear Trump talk not just about energy independence, but energy dominance. I really hate that term. And we have to talk about it differently in terms of oil and natural gas, too. So let's start with oil. Yes, the U.S. is the world's largest producer of oil. We're now a significant exporter of crude oil and refined products. These things are all true. But oil is priced on a global market. The price that we get for our oil is checking for quality and transportation costs, the same price that everybody else gets for their oil. It's globally fungible, and oil prices are set globally. So you hear the president say, the Strait of Hormuz doesn't matter for us. Meanwhile, you see Americans complaining that gas is over $4 a gallon now, which I'm surprised is not higher. But that's because we are connected to the global market. On the natural gas side, it's quite different. The U.S. is a significant, in fact, the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. And we're export limited. We have a lot of natural gas production in the United States, and all those LNG facilities are going as hard as they can. They're exporting every molecule of natural gas that they can, and still the U.S. has plenty of gas. And so we are insulated on the natural gas side. But the thing that most voters care about, and the price that you see driving down the road, is gasoline or diesel prices. And those are completely connected to the world market, and we should care about what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz.
I agree that the trickle-down effect, the secondary knock-on effects are very clear. That I think a lot of people can unfortunately look at the first-order effects only, but it goes far beyond that. And the United States, some people claim that this is all part of a grand strategy towards dealing with China, that Trump has this desire to knock Venezuela and Iran out of the equation, to weaken China's supply chains, energy systems, and so on. Can you explain why that, I think, is a bit far-fetched, or do you think that's...
I can absolutely claim that that's far-fetched. And I think the situation is quite different in Venezuela and Iran. And I think one of the problems that we're having today is that folks in the administration wanted to equate those when that was a really bad thing to do. So let's start with Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela was relatively easy to sort of go in and at least knock out the top of their regime. They have significant oil reserves. However, their oil industry has been underinvested in for years and is held together with chewing gum and duct tape. And so bringing other oil companies in, including American ones, but also others, really could increase Venezuelan oil production, but over time, not quickly. That was never going to happen in Iran. In Iran, you have a regime that has, that believes that, they're divinely in charge of this country. I mean, that the regime is based on God and beliefs. We're not going to just be able to go in there and knock that out and install a different kind of government. I mean, these folks are fighting for their lives and their ideology, and they're not just fighting for oil. And so that was never going to work in Iran the way it actually did work in Venezuela. Not going to happen. But then this sort of idea that there's a game of 3 or 4D chess happening, and that America is doing this to weaken the Chinese, and I deeply don't buy that for a number of reasons. Probably the most important reason why, even if it was a strategy, I don't think it would work, is that if you look at Chinese energy policy and strategy, energy security has been top of mind for them for a long time. They've worked on diversifying their supplies, on working with the supplies they have domestically, because they've been really worried about their economic growth being derailed by some sort of energy crisis. They were more prepared for this than the rest of the world, because this has been top of mind for them for a while. And so you look at, let's say on the electricity side, what they've done is they've combined rapidly growing renewables with their indigenous coal generation. So they are somewhat protected, although they're a significant LNG buyer as well. They've been thinking about this for a long time, and their energy system is built around it. Somewhat true on the oil side. Additionally, oil is a transportation fuel. And so part of the reason, and one reason why China has gone so heavily into EVs and batteries and EV manufacturing, is they wanted to lead this industry that they saw as shaping the world. But it is also true that they do it for energy security reasons. China actually produces a significant amount of oil, but not nearly enough to cover its needs. And so it's an energy security strategy to lean more towards electric vehicles. And then that brings it over to renewables and coal that they control rather than oil that they do to a much lesser extent. And so I actually think China was better prepared for this crisis than the rest of the world in many important ways. And if the world reacts to this by saying, oh, wow, fossil fuels are riskier than we thought and perhaps more expensive in the future than we thought they were going to be, that's a win for China. So this was a strategy. I don't think it was a good one.
No, I just, on that point, and I'm not sure if there's a bit of it's your headphones, but there's a little bit of noise on your side. I think it's just like from the table maybe or something, but just
okay,
maybe it's your chair. Your chair's moving underneath the table.
Oh, okay. Let me sit very still then.
No. I can.
That's something I'm good at.
I'm not sure if people can hear that on the other side. I don't think it's me, but I just wanted to notify you.
No problem. We'll do what we can.
No, but on the situation, rumbling noise. But on the Chinese element, I was under the understanding that they had around 4 to 5 months worth of reserves, and after that, they would start feeling some degree of pressure. You don't find, was that the case? Is there something else there that I'm missing?
No, I completely agree with that.
How much could China endure this? And were they part of pressuring Iran to accept the ceasefire yesterday, as was reported by Associated Press, if I remember?
I don't have any more information than you or your listeners do on whether or not China was involved in pressure one way or the other on the ceasefire agreement. But I honestly think the whole world wants the strait to be open again. I mean, so it wouldn't surprise me if they did, and that wouldn't necessarily be a nefarious thing. It is true that China has the world's largest oil reserves, and it kind of furthers the argument I made earlier that China has been super concerned about energy security for a long time. Diversifying has been one of their strategies, and keeping reserves has been another. So I think China is one of the best prepared countries in the world to deal with this.
Well, and then on the other side is, of course, Europe and Asia more broadly. There's been a growing concern around access to fertilizer for India. And the minute that Trump, what did he sign? One of those executive clauses to allow the loosening of sanctions pressure on Russia, we saw a notable amount of ships redirecting from China almost instantaneously to India because of that growing pressure. So when you look at the energy security across the world based on different regions or specific countries, who really is suffering the most, but also would benefit from this ceasefire holding, even if they have poor relations with the Americans or Israelis or whatever?
Yeah. So I think the way to think about this, you hear President Trump say our oil doesn't come from there. That's an Asian and a European problem. It's a global problem, but it does matter where that oil usually goes in terms of just shipping times and having to rearrange oil supply, which takes a long time. Just for a little background, if you think about how long it takes an oil tanker to go from the Persian Gulf to various markets, it's a week or two to Asia, depending on where you are. It's more like 4 to 6 weeks to Europe or the Americas, depending on whether it goes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal or whether it goes around the Cape of Good Hope. But so the first markets to be affected by real shortage.
Well, you're live, we can see.
Sorry about that. My phone was ringing. I needed to make it stop. Okay, so the first countries to be affected by real shortage were the countries in Asia, because the lack of supply, in a sense, got there first. And so they would be, once supply is back again, they will be the ones who will benefit first, just because of the shorter shipping time, not because of any sort of geopolitical pressures or anything. It's easier to get there. It's also the reason why in other countries, we're not feeling a real shortage yet. Because if you think of that 3 to 6 week time frame, a lot of oil is still on the water on its way to those other markets. And so in a sense, the shortage hasn't gotten there yet. And so first to lose oil will be the first to get it back, purely in a supply point of view. And then everyone benefits over, the many months it'll take for the market to find a new equilibrium. But there's sort of short-term effects and longer-term effects.
But if you've got the growing, comments by Trump around not just European countries or NATO, but also towards Japan, Korea, countries that really were in a energy insecure environment, and he's threatening them, could we see a growing just divergence away from America as a provider of energy? Because they've benefited from that quite a lot, right? Or it goes.
I mean, I see the point of view of many countries of the security of fossil fuel supply being very different after this. I mean, the Persian Gulf producers have been seen as very reliable suppliers. That's going to change now, just because our thoughts about what can happen in the Strait have fundamentally changed. But with the US too, I mean, we've also been seen as a reliable, non-political provider of oil and gas. And so if this goes on, and if Trump continues to use our oil and gas supply as a cudgel to get other agreements out of countries, be they trade or something else, then we're not the apolitical, reliable supplier that we were either, and we're seen as less secure. So I really worry about that in this push for dominance, which has kind of a negative connotation to it. I don't like that term because it implies this kinds of things. We will lord our energy over you in a way that I find disturbing. I'd much rather we be the friendly market-based apolitical provider of fuel, and a provider, as an aside, that can do it with quite good environmental standards. I mean, we care about that in this country.
No, absolutely. But okay, then very simply then, who benefits the most in these kinds of conditions, in such energy crisis as this? Is this all part of a desire by the United States to try and force Europe to be more and more dependent on them because they don't have access to Gulf energy, the Qatari LNG, which was, an offset for the reduction of reliance on a Russian LNG? Who are the biggest beneficiaries, but also, or biggest winners and losers? Let's just put it like that.
Well, I gotta say, just as a preface, I don't think our leaders thought all the way through. I think they thought this would be quicker. I don't think that they thought the Strait would be blocked. I mean, it's shocking for me to say that.
I'm surprised to hear you say that, Samantha. I really am.
It's very painful to say that. But I've heard them say things like, we didn't expect that they'd block the Strait of Hormuz. We thought they would have capitulated by then. It's painful. Or we didn't think they'd strike out at their Gulf neighbors. And I was like, well, a lot of us thought that would happen. So, I mean, hardly anybody wins from this. This is just bad. But I will say that the more immediate winners from this are Russia and China. Russia, because this pressures the world to buy more Russian fuels because we're just short. Europe is saying we're still not buying Russian gas. We're out of that business. And I hope they stay that way. But there's pressure now with the loss of Qatari LNG to buy more fuels from other places. And then I think China is winning because, like I said before, China is one of the countries best prepared to deal with this disruption. And they've been so focused on alternative fuels, electric vehicles, renewable energy, well, and also coal, because they have a lot of it, that they're a little more insulated. I mean, obviously they're a big importer as well, but they've been thinking for a long time about how to insulate their economy from energy security concerns. So that's not what you want to hear.
As the host of the Global Gambit, I have to retain a certain degree of objectivity. I mean, I have my biases, of course, but I have to retain my sense of balance for sake of argument, right, Samantha? But we cover Russia, Ukraine a lot on the show, and my audience, I think, are very interested to understand just how far Russia can potentially benefit from this. They've been making $150 million a day, or they've made over $1 billion in the past week alone. The numbers vary a lot, but they're obviously significant for Putin's war chest and his capacity to sustain his war against Ukraine. So if we continue to see the ceasefire being volatile and Iran, choosing to disrupt or impede the flows through the Strait, what does that mean for Moscow? What does that mean for other major energy players? Exporters?
Yeah, I'll respond quickly to your sort of objectivity question too, just for a second. I work for a nonpartisan organization as well. The opinions I state are mine, not those of my organization, but I'm also in the truth-telling business, and I'll be as honest as I possibly can in the conversation. So I mentioned earlier that Iran was making more money on its oil sales, in part because when we unsanctioned them, they could be sold at the market price. The same is true of Russian oil. We also removed sanctions on Russian oil that was on the water. And that same thing is true. You mentioned those ships turning around. Well, that oil no longer needed to be sold either on the down low or under the price cap. It could be sold at the market price because it was unsanctioned. And so you're right, that adds to Putin's sort of war chest. The other thing that I'll say is it really just depends on how long this goes on. If we continue to leave Russian energy products unsanctioned because we are concerned just about supply altogether, whether Europe takes back Russian pipeline supply, which I greatly hope it doesn't, but because of what's happened to Qatar, there will be political pressure to do so, and I hope the EU holds the line on that. The other thing that I'll say that's apart from energy markets is that the U.S. is spending a lot of material in this war in Iran. A lot of interceptors, a lot of missiles, a lot of equipment that might have otherwise gone to Ukraine. Now we're looking. I don't know exact numbers on this, so I don't want to say we're short on material, but clearly we have less than we did before because we spent it in this conflict in Iran. And so that could be a rather indirect but nonetheless important impact on the conflict in Ukraine.
I do worry about the spillover effects. Obviously, Zelensky was in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, just a couple of days ago, end of last week. And I think that's quite notable for the relationship between those two. But on Saudi Arabia is obviously one of the great powers or regional players, aspiring to be hegemon. What do you think MBS's calculus is in this? They've seen a significant redirection of energy as a contingency plan, across Saudi Arabia. It's added an additional 2-3 days, let alone the cost and the logistics of it all. What do you think is going through the mind of MBS, Saudi Arabia, and their relationship to the United States, the petrodollar, all of that? I know it's a big question, but
it's a huge question, but it's a very sensible question. And I kind of see a couple sides of this. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia is the best prepared of the Gulf oil and gas producers because they have this 7 million barrel a day, roughly, pipeline that goes across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea. And so that completely bypasses the Strait of Hormuz And so that's the primary thing that, rather than the 20 million barrel a day disruption you would have if nothing came out of the Gulf, it's more like 11 or 12 million barrels a day. That's the main thing. So the Saudis are hurting, but better off than their neighbors because they built this pipeline. And so that's important to consider. Although, I mean, Saudi also needs the revenues probably more than any of the other Gulf producers. So this is a tough one for the Saudis. I mean, there's no love lost between them and the Iranians. On the one hand, maybe they would like to see us finish the job and have Iran finish the job and be less of a threat to Saudi territory than it has been in the past. This is not the first time we've seen them attack Saudi energy facilities. The flip side of that is we, the United States, dragged the Saudis into a conflict that they didn't sign up for. They had no part of this. You know, they were innocent bystanders until the Iranians started lobbing missiles and drones at their facilities. So it is difficult to think about how MBS and his government might think about this, because I can see two sides to it. And there's also, like, you can't go back. We're here now. And so I think their opinion on this conflict might be different now than it was before it started. So, you know, we're in a different place and you can't go back and change the past. But
if I could just follow up on that, though, because obviously we saw in Yemen, and I appreciate if you have, limited time, so I've got like a couple more questions for you.
Yeah,
but
good.
As a tag on to this, the Saudis and the Emiratis saw this big rupture in their relations over Yemen in January because of operations down there.
Yeah.
So we've now, what I see and has, I think, largely been agreed on, a growing couple of blocks shifting the balance of power. It used to be Saudi Arabia, Iran, primarily the two major stakeholders. But now you have the Pakistanis and the Saudis, and I think it's Qatar in one block, and then the Israelis, Turkey, and then Qatar, Israel, and the Emirates in the other block, right? And they're trying to counterbalance. So what does that do for the energy architecture in the Middle East? Does it have any implications or not really?
It's a really interesting question. I'm not sure what it means for the energy architecture, but for just relations in the region, it's a very interesting question where this is going to go going forward. And there's also countries in the region are suffering varying degrees of pain. The Saudis they need the revenue more than some of the other countries just for their own fiscal reasons, but they also are able to export more of their oil than any of the other countries. The Qataris are generally not hurting for money, but on the other hand, their overwhelming source of revenue is completely shut down. And 2 of the 14 liquefaction trains are destroyed. And so, you know, the Qataris are generally in a more comfortable fiscal position, but they are absolutely shut out of the market right now because there's no way to get LNG out. All of their facilities, their entire territory is inside the Persian Gulf, and it has nowhere to go. And so how long this goes on and how the politics of it sorts out, I think may change the balance of power around these countries. But I think it's also important to remember the levels of pain and the starting points of different countries, because that's going to matter too. Some are in better fiscal situations than others, and some are being hurt more because of where their facilities are and their ability to have workarounds.
So we've had an interesting guest on a couple of times called Anis Abhijar. He runs a very notable Substack. He primarily looks at oil and gas, but we had him on a couple of weeks ago during some of the height of the discussion around the Strait. And his emphasis wasn't so much about just energy security, it was also about the insurance and that everything. So can you explain that to me and everyone? What does that mean? Why is insurance such a big element of all of this, and how will that impact it?
Yeah, I mean, Iranian threats and insurance are one of the main reasons why the Strait is closed. It's not physically closed. But what Iran has done is made threats against ships, and in some cases shown that it's serious by hitting a few ships. I think it's more than 20 at this point. And so at that point, insurers either won't insure ships that are passing through the Strait of Hormuz, or the rates are astronomical because the risk is just too high. So at that point, the strait is essentially closed, even though it's not mined or blockaded or shut in some physical way. And that also has implications for when the strait opens again. I mean, from what I've read so far, and we're still early days, I haven't seen folks talk about a change in the insurance markets coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. And if you can't insure a ship to make that passage doesn't happen. And so that's going to depend on the risk tolerance and the risk calculations and how the insurance companies understand the level of risk going to the strait. And that's not going to change on a dime. They're going to want to see, really concrete assurances that those ships aren't going to be hit. And so this sounds a little silly, but where the rubber meets the road in terms of the strait being closed is the insurance markets as much as anything else.
Okay, and I guess then just a quick tag on to that, before I ask you sort of where does this go kind of question, but what should actors outside this be doing? If you were advising Europe, if you're advising different groups, how do we navigate this seemingly fragile, conditional ceasefire that's holding right and energy provisions, the security associated with that?
Yeah, I've been saying for several weeks, the thing the world needs is a negotiated solution to this. Fragile ceasefires where we're not entirely sure that both sides agree on the particulars, it's a start. We're beginning to agree on something. But what we really need to stabilize energy markets and to frankly stabilize the global economy is you need a real peace agreement. I'm not sure where we're going to go or whether Iran is going to be better off at the end of this. They might be. But you need a real agreement to open this, not just a fragile ceasefire we're not so sure about.
Okay, and that's the desired outcome. That's the preferred outcome.
Necessary outcome.
What's the realistic outcome? What would you encourage people to watch out for? What do you think is actually going to happen? Are the collapse and we're going to be in apocalypse now again, or is it or can we end on a light note with your contribution?
I hate to predict apocalypse. I can try to end on a light note. But in all honesty, the world really needs a negotiated solution to this. But we're in a situation right now where the Iranians see this as existential to their survival. And they're a theocratic regime. It's not just about their survival. It has religious notions to it. And then the U.S. doesn't want to be embarrassed. And, we have various things that our administration is thinking about. And we're going to have to find a way through the rock and the hard place in order to find a solution to this. Until we get that, it is going to continue to be rocky. And what you hope is that folks around the world, both allies of the United States and of the Iranians and other forces, come together and really put pressure on them to, look, you got to figure this out. Because the implications of this strait remaining closed are very serious, and we're not entirely feeling them yet because of the travel time. And so you really need a negotiated solution to this.
Can I be cheeky? Sorry, I know I keep saying last
Absolutely.
question. What do you think is the most likely scenario? If you had to map out worst case, most realistic, most optimistic scenarios, is it a case of a joint toll booth venture between the Omanis and the Iranians with some kind of unique input from the US and the Gulf states, or it's impossible to predict?
I think it's almost impossible to predict. I see people talking about a toll, I think because it feels like somewhere we can go now, but I really think we need to think about the implications of that toll for the Iranian regime going forward and for stability in that area. If that's the only place we can realistically get to, then I think we go there, but it's certainly not the outcome I prefer because of all the things I've talked about earlier.
All right.
I wish I had a light note to end on, but this is just a really tough one.
No, it's well, we can light up. There's a pun in there somewhere about oil and fire or something. Sorry, there's a pun in there.
There's got to be a joke in there somewhere. But actually, the real situation is really concerning, and I just keep talking about it.
Well, no, but Samantha Gross, Director of Energy Security and Climate Initiative at Brookings Institute, It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. I do hope to have you back very soon. I'm going to stay on because we've got a couple more guests joining us over the next hour and a bit. But certainly I will share this this particular segment with you when it's complete, and everyone do check out Brookings Institute.
Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and I'll say goodbye to you and your guests.
Thank you very much. Take care. All right, everyone. So that was Samantha Gross of the Brookings Institute. It is a non-partisan, centrist organization in Washington, D.C. I think it was literally opposite Johns Hopkins when I went to university there, but I would go and sit in their lectures many times and listen to some of their open conversations, and it's been a really useful source of information. And I think Samantha certainly gave me a lot of food for thought, a lot of pragmatic takeaways. You know, we've got some people who are more ideologically driven, or we've got some more pragmatists. And I think Samantha made some that's the reality of the situation. We would prefer it to be negotiated, et cetera, But we're going to be joined by a couple of other guests over the next hour and a bit. And I'm looking forward to having a new guest in the form of David Dowd, who is he's an expert on Lebanon and Hezbollah at the Foundation of Defending Democracies, I think it is, or the FDD. So he's going to be quite different to the Perspective Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. It's another non-profit organization in DC. And he's going to be a bit more, I think, hawkish, a little bit more opinionated or strongly worded in his perspective on the situation, versus some other comments that we've heard earlier or yesterday or something like that. But before him, we're also going to be joined by a returning guest who we had on, I think, last week when we had a bit of a back and forth between him and Daniel Boardman, Amir Hajjani. Amir Hajjani is a non-resident fellow with the Quincy Institute, who we've also hosted some staff like Trita Parsi and Anatole Liven from. So, yeah, we're going to get two quite different opinions. One that is more restraint, emphasizing that, you know, we should be exercising restraint, versus someone who's more hawkish and emphasizing sort of, you know, combat operations are necessary. So I'm very interested to hear what both of them have to say. But first, do like and subscribe, guys. Do support the stream. I'm going to try and do these every day for maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, or if there's not as much news, then maybe something slightly shorter. But I find it the best way to keep the stream going is just to have one long segment and have guests joining in and out, as we have done. But I wanted to read a couple of updates here because we're seeing, obviously, news continue to emerge. And one of them was actually about the British. In the past few hours, there's been a growing sort of revelation around the incompetence of the British government, or specifically the British Navy. The UK has a frigate known as HMS Dragon, not frigate, warship called HMS Dragon. It's one of our primary assets, and it was meant to come out to the Eastern Mediterranean a good while back. It was meant to sort of support the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, but it didn't. It was in Southampton, in Portsmouth, in the south of England, being serviced. And then the British government, Sir Keir Starmer, decided not to send it at all, which I think was a mistake. I was very critical, as some of you saw on the secondary channel, my media clips channel, where I appeared on the media, on the news, and was very critical of the British government, because I think that we should have been a lot more proactive in sending our assets to the US, to the Med, to support the French and others. So it's not great that the British have not sent HMS Dragon, but then it got worse. It got worse because there was a water malfunction. The ship didn't have functioning water supply, so they couldn't. Well, the crew would not be able to inhabit the boat, the vessel, because they don't have access to a sustainable water supply. The country that was once the ruler of the waves Britannia rule the waves. Not that I'm supporting imperialism, but the UK has fallen quite far by the wayside, and I think it's rather embarrassing. And normally I would like to try to defend the UK, be it on Twitter or something. You'll see posts and I'll be like, no, that's unfair, that's an overly harsh criticism, or that's blown out of proportion. But no, in this instance, it's true. And even the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago said that the UK has to accept that it's no longer a global power. And I think that that's a very staunch admittance from obviously a pretty neutral newspaper, let alone one of the oldest and respected in the UK, or let alone the globe. And, you know, some people could argue that this is the sort of the British suffering another Suez crisis. Certainly some people have felt that this is the United States, Trump's Suez crisis in 1956, when the British and the French, in cooperation with the Israelis, launched an attempt to seize and control the Suez Canal from Egypt. It obviously became apparent that the British could not really act without seeking a green light from the Americans, because the Americans threatened to cut a lot of funding and support the UK, which was still obviously rebuilding after the Second World War. Now, you can argue that obviously the British Empire was in decline after the First World War, after the Second World War, but it was really 1956 when it became largely agreed that Britain was no longer the global power that it had been 50 years prior. So it's that's one story that I've seen today, which I think is pretty notable. Now, I also wanted to cover obviously the core couple of issues around the ceasefire. So right now we have varying degrees of information, understanding about whether or not this ceasefire is going to hold. The Trump administration, in the press conference that was given about 5-6 hours ago, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, made it clear that there were 3 military objectives, and I said this to Samantha earlier, which is they were: 1, to destroy, dismantle Iran's ballistic and drone capabilities; 2, to destroy Iran's navy, the Iranian navy; and 3, dismantle, destroy Iran's defense industrial capacity. Within an hour of the ceasefire taking effect, or effectively being implemented, it became apparent that drones, projectiles of different forms, were being fired, being launched and targeted towards both Israel and Iran, but also into Lebanon. So it was, again, multiple cases of violations. And this has continued throughout since last night that the ceasefire was effectively implemented. So there's obviously now the Iranians have been threatening to close the strait. They effectively have closed the strait. And we seem to be back at square one. Now, the messaging, the telegraphing from the Trump administration is that they never agreed, or that Lebanon was never actually part of this conditional ceasefire. It was always just Iran, Israel. The problem with that is that there was a rather vague set of statements. I took us through them all late last night, the 10 points of the Iranian side, which Trump was particularly using as the framework. And the first 3 points were about the cessation of hostilities across the rest of the Middle East. And by default, therefore, Lebanon is incorporated into that. Now, if you want my honest opinion, my personal opinion from just what we're seeing happening, is that I didn't think that this was going to last. I was pretty set on the fact that Israel would continue in this form, in some shape or form. This is the set of questions, or one of the questions I'm going to ask David later on. I'm sure we're going to have a bit of a heated debate about that. But essentially, the Israelis were always going to continue their operations, maybe not directly with Iran, but they will continue them over Hezbollah and Lebanon, because they don't think, from their perspective, that the Lebanon government has done enough to dismantle, dismember the Hezbollah militia, or whatever proxy, and therefore they're going to do it themselves, and therefore they're going to occupy southern Lebanon, and therefore this continues. Iran has made it clear that they will not accept that Israel has to stop its operations over Lebanon and Hezbollah if the Strait of Hormuz is going to continue to be reopened. And this is where I began to think, well, clearly this is going to be a huge rupture for the United States and Israel. Netanyahu and Trump have a decent relationship, but I don't think it's free of its limitations. I think Trump has been fed up with the over efforts of Netanyahu to pressure him, persuade him, coerce him, whatever, into getting involved with the with the war in Iran. He took a while to agree to the Operation Midnight Hammer. Obviously, the Iranians and the Israelis have been sparring, exchanging missile fire for a long time, and then Trump was like, "Okay, fine, we'll do something." And clearly, this is what happened again in the run-up to Operation Epic Fury. But I think even Trump has his limits, right? He thinks he's had enough of the war, he's tired of the markets being disrupted, and he wants out. But Netanyahu and his government, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and those types don't. This is obviously a much bigger threat for them because of their being in the region and what Iran poses to them as a threat. So they don't want to see this end. So they're trying to encourage the Americans to join their framing that Lebanon isn't part of the ceasefire. But by doing that and seemingly winning the Trump administration round onto that, they're basically encouraging them to make the ceasefire void, because the Iranians are not going to keep the Strait of Hormuz open or allow it to be. They're going to put more and more pressure on that. And so I don't really understand where this is going. I'm a bit confused by the US's walk back or sort of shift in position. So I'm not entirely sure what happens there, but that's what I want to discuss, firstly with Amir and then with David. So just reading here, Israel has launched its most powerful strike on Lebanon since the war. The Israeli military struck more than 100 Hezbollah targets in Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and southern Lebanon. Around 50 fighter jets took part in the operation. So this is a day after the ceasefire has seemingly been established. They have decided to launch their biggest set of operations. So I'm just going to bring up a map here so that I can actually see where we're talking about properly. Mountain peaks, we're just outside. Okay, we're near a place that I did actually visit once. When I was like 4 years old. So we're right up in the north, sort of just southeast of Tripoli. So if I show you on this map here, share screen, Bekaa Valley. So these guys, so this is around the area that the IAF, or the Israeli Air Force, has launched some operations. So just reading here, according to the military, about 160 munitions were fired within 10 minutes. Some of the targets were located within populated areas. This heart is somewhere that I've been when I was young in the 90s. I went to Lebanon, I went to Beirut, and then we went to this area up here, just in case you're wondering what that is. Lebanon's health ministry has reported that hundreds of wounded and dozens have been killed. The death toll stands at about 254, and 1,100 or 1,100 have been injured. According to the Associated Press, this marks one of the deadliest days in the conflict with Hezbollah, because obviously the war didn't start initially with Hezbollah being a part of it. They actually got involved, I think, about a week, maybe 5 days afterwards. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, over the past month, more than 1,500 people have been killed in Lebanon, right? Now, I think it's about 3,500 have been killed in Iran. And this is obviously 3,500 too many, but relative to the size of the population, Iran is 92, 93 million. Lebanon's is, I don't think it's even 10 million. I think it's about 8. So as a percentage of the population, as a proportion of the population, Lebanon's population is not even 6 million. It's about 5.8 million. So this is a huge cost to the country. And I think what's most heartbreaking about it is that Lebanon has obviously been suffering hugely in the past few years as it stands. Some of you have joined some of the streams we've done in the past few days. It's been suffering ever since really 2020. The country's been affected by the civil war in Syria. So ever since 2011, it managed to escape too many spillover effects, but because of how multifaceted, multiracial, multi-ethnic the country is, if you look at the ethnic makeup of the country, it's always had a slight issue with ethnic tensions and stuff like that. Like if we look at an ethnic map, for example, just here, it's a bit crude, but I think it will give you an impression. Lebanon has been really struggling to keep sort of ethnic spillovers with like the Alawites and things like that. And then you had the significant explosion, I think it was in 2020, when you had the United, let me see here. I'm just trying to find a good sort of map here to show you of the ethnic makeup of the Lebanon of the country, because it does really vary quite a lot. It's pretty crazy just how sort of multi-dimensional the country has been, but how peaceful it's been. So it's primarily split between obviously Christianity and Islam. This one here. So let's use this. My computer's really lagging. So the ethno-religious diversity of Lebanon. So you've had Christianity, that's Maronite, Catholics, Greek Orthodoxy. And you can see that those vary significantly, and that's more to the western side. But then if you go to consider Islam, right? So a large proportion of the southern territory is Shia Islam. And that's where Hezbollah is very active, obviously, because they are taking it upon themselves to defend their brothers and sisters, their Shia brothers and sisters. I'm not a religious expert by any means, by the way, but in principle, that's often what you'll hear the Israelis arguing is their motivations. So it's a pretty complicated picture, and because of the consequences of October 7th and Israel's operations over Gaza and then broader Palestine, and then of course shifting towards Hezbollah, Lebanon has been basically in a non-stop period of conflict, of instability. So I think that it's tragic to see the situation not stabilize, not securitize, not improve for Lebanon. Netanyahu stressed that the ceasefire with Iran does not apply to Lebanon. Quote, he said, "Today we're delivering the strongest blow to Hezbollah since the Pager operation," which again, the Pager operation is that one that the IDF carried out. I think it was in late 2024 when they took out Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. So significant damage done to Hezbollah, but like the regime change supposedly in Iran, Hezbollah still exists. They still operate, and they still are clearly quite potent, still able to hold their own against Israel. They still have one of the largest stockpiles of rockets, missiles, whatever in the world. And I don't think that this is going to be ending anytime soon. But on that fact, and we should be being joined here in a couple of minutes by Amir, is about the regime change. There was a very good segment, a very crisp summary of what regime change actually means and why that hasn't been achieved in Iran, right? Regime change in its purest sense is not just the destruction of the political leadership. It is the complete and utter disintegration, dismantling, dismembering of the governing system. So that means Iran has had, yes, a large proportion of its political leadership killed, but not, right? And there was a funny meme I saw earlier, which was just a list on Wikipedia showing, the key actors involved in this war. And it said, head of the current situation, Qasem Atoya Khamenei, Ali Khamenei Jr., as in Junior is still there, he's still living. So we didn't even really achieve full decapitation of the political leadership. But it goes further, because aside from that, you have the institutional framework, and that means the military system, the military institutions. The IRGC is obviously the most obvious case, but also arguably the besieged militia. This is a militia group of 100,000. And then we've also got the consideration of Artesh, which is the actual conventional military. So whilst the IRGC manages foreign relations, foreign policy, proxies, etc., the Artesh is focused on security and defense in Iran, at home, of the sovereignty of the border, of the borders. But that's just part one, the military infrastructure. Then you've got the security forces and the police. Those need to be effectively degraded or significantly changed, altered in a way that they don't just operate under the same rules and guise that they had before. And then a third is the courts, the judicial system, which in Iran is obviously incredibly important. It's the judiciary, some of the biggest organs under the very complex system that exists in Iran. They've barely been touched. And so the clerics, the senior clerics and theocratic components to this system all largely still function. They're all largely still intact. You know, there's been a significant destruction. 6,500 IRG staff or personnel were claimed to be killed the last time I looked. But that's still a fraction of the numbers of people that you would have to systematically and verifiably take out. Because only if you go down the ladder of seniority so far do you remove anyone with a strategic vision, anyone with the clear plan, or an idea of what happens afterwards. It's a bit like that series with the guy who played Jack Bauer, Keith Sutherland, right? Last Survivor, whatever the show was on Netflix, etc. The Designated Survivor, right? So you've got multiple designated survivors at different levels within the system who deliberately are ready to take up the position immediately or take up the responsibilities if and when one of their senior officers or whoever their counterparts is taken out. So yeah, 24. Jack Bauer in 24 is a great series. So you've got multiple effectively designated survivors or designated replacements in a system of this. Iran doesn't exist in its current form without a clear, day after tomorrow plan, right? It's not, this is what they've been planning for, and it's a lot more than simply just removing a couple of people. And as we said from the beginning, two things from the beginning. Firstly, the Trump administration have been changing their tune. They have been shifting the goalposts on what were the intended strategic and military objectives. Of the three that I outlisted earlier about removing the Navy, the ballistic and drone capacity, and the overall defense industry, two of those were never really on the table at the beginning of this entire campaign. It was always about regime change or leadership change or a significant shift. And that's without even going into the nuclear capabilities of all that. And the point is that after all of this, you still have a country which is battered and bruised, and the economy, the social cohesion, a lot of it is significantly set back. But the system that governs it all is still largely intact. And therefore, the Iranian people are waking up to and going day to day with their lives since the proclaimed ceasefire yesterday, with not much of an impression that's different. You can look at anyone online, any Iranian comments, and most of them will agree that overall their day-to-day lives have not changed. They don't suddenly think that they are inhabiting a completely different system. It's changed. It has not changed much. I'm just going to check if Amir is joining us. And then we will continue. He should be joining us now, or hopefully in the next couple of minutes. I'm curious to hear what he has to say. But yeah, now this was another key critical component here, which is that the ceasefire agreement that was established yesterday between the US and Iran was reached without Israeli consultation, which is perhaps why they've decided to go behind the back or whatever, defy the United States and continue their operations. A bit of a snub, which is why I think the relationship between the United States or Bibi Netanyahu and Trump has its limits and will be tested, even if the United States has come round to agreeing with their sort of the Israeli framing that this is the ceasefire doesn't include Lebanon. I still personally think that the Americans want out. They want to draw down. They want to reduce their military activity, but they can't do so if Israel continues to strike Lebanon. So even if the Americans and Iranians do continue negotiating, I question how likely it is that it's going to succeed, because the two are being impeded by Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. Now, what we're also seeing here, Trump has said that the US will be discussing, or Trump will be, so this comes, this is quite an interesting one. So Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, is stating that Trump will be discussing the US withdrawing from NATO today. Now, if I'm brutally honest, I don't know what he's going to be discussing, because he can't just withdraw. He has to seek approval from Congress, and 2/3 of that, as we've discussed. As I discussed in another video, you need 2/3 agreement, and the United States. Well, I still don't. I think Trump would want to do that just as a symbolic gesture, as a gesture to prove that he can. But ultimately, the US can still remain in NATO, but not do anything. It can cut funding, but just sort of remain there as like a dormant entity, right? It's just there in the background, but it doesn't really do anything. And I don't think Congress would agree to that. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, I remain to be seen whether or not the Trump administration can try to do something about this. But it's what I said yesterday. It's what I said yesterday, that the United States, Trump will, he'll move on. He will move on from the war in the Middle East. His attention will shift back to distracting from the Epstein files or something. His attention will shift back to NATO and hating on Europe. And as we've seen in the National Security Strategy released in November, and then the NDS, or National Defense Strategy, Europe was the primary recipient of Trump's hatred, vitriol, criticism, the civilization erasure, which is effectively what he said last night, and everyone seems to have forgotten his implicit threats of genocide. I think we should remember that. That Europe is the problem. It's not Putin. It's not North Korea. It's not the CCP. It's Europe. So Greenland will become a hot topic again. In June, we have NATO's summit, if I remember correctly, in mid-June. I might be attending that on the periphery, but certainly I don't think Trump would go. And if he did, he would use it as an opportunity to make big, grandiose statements, threats. I mean, we're a bit far away from that. It's about 8 weeks away, 9-10 weeks away. But the point is that certainly I think as we enter the late spring, early summer, he's really going to be putting and if the war in Iran really does wind down, at least for the United States, then he's going to be putting a lot of emphasis on the UK, on NATO, to on Greenland, on Canada, on he's near abroad again. But also, as I say, Cuba, excuse me. I think he's going to be making moves on Cuba. I don't know if he's going to be doing what he did in Iran, but certainly he's going to be using economic coercion and pressure. Yeah. It's okay. So I'm reading here from next to that. Donald Trump is set to discuss a historic issue, a potential US withdrawal from the alliance. That's not true. Let me just write this here. All right. Well, let's see what's going. Yeah, the next 3 years are going to be long. I mean, I think the next 3 days are going to be long, to be honest with you. I'm not sure where Amir has got to, and let me just switch my cameras here and see if I can get a hold of him. Oh, well, okay, I cut the top of my head off, but that works. So let's see if we can get Amir on. Okay, this is the problem trying to run an international program and podcast. There's often a lot of miscommunication or understanding around time zones. Let's see if he can join. But yeah, so let me I like to use this better camera because it's better quality for you guys. And I also have another phone now which I can text. So anyway, the magic of live radio. Exactly, Ollie. Now let's look at some other updates here. I don't think the NATO thing is possible. You can't just withdraw from NATO. Yeah, I'm just going to read a bit of update from the Institute of the Study for War, which I think is a pretty spot on institution. I know they have their criticisms, but so does everything. But according to them, so the ceasefire with Iran remains incredibly fragile today, though ceasefire implementation is always challenging and will take time. Large-scale attacks from both sides stopped after the ceasefire went into effect, but reports of cease violations have continued. Iran has now begun threatening to break the ceasefire after major Israeli attacks against Lebanese Hezbollah. The conflict between Hezbollah and Israel was not part of the ceasefire. Of course, that's subsequent claims by the US administration. The other, obviously, key party in all of this is Pakistan. The Pakistani Prime Minister has accused unspecified parties of ceasefire violations and called for adherence to the ceasefire, while the UAE has said Iran had launched 17 ballistic missiles and 35 drones targeting the UAE after the ceasefire. And we touched a little bit on that with Samantha earlier as well. Ceasefire implementation takes time, however, especially given the degraded state of Iran command and control. And from my understanding, Mojtaba, the supreme leader, had ordered the IRGC and military officers, staff to begin respecting the ceasefire. General Dan Kane had provided an operational update, highlighting that the combined force had destroyed 80% of Iranian air defenses, 800 one-way attack drone storage facilities, 450 ballistic missile facilities, and more than 150 ships. So that's a pretty comprehensive overview. But what I find frustrating sometimes is that it can be a little bit too much about, well, look at all the numbers and how much we destroyed everything. Suggesting that they destroyed 11,000 assets, right? It's a bit of an arbitrary number, and I don't really know what that means. How are we supposed to interpret such a figure? It's a little bit of a redundant, I think, statement, but for this administration, sounds really good to use that bigger of a number. I'm just going to switch cameras again to see if. Oh no, I just turned it off. I'm just going to see if Amir is having trouble joining us. So you're going to lose part of my head here. Okay, so Amir doesn't seem like he's going to be able to join us, or he hasn't seen. Well, I guess we can just continue to provide updates for the time being. I'm going to keep my camera like this for now. this is the problem. This is why, being a largely one-man show, you need people to help you with guest scheduling. So if you're interested in doing that, then do get in touch. I'm looking to bring on a couple of people to help with guest scheduling, guest relations, things like that, to help, streamline the show so that I can manage running these live streams, but also posting more content that is pre-recorded, or cutting some of these live streams into bouts. But yeah, do drop a comment, or do drop me a line, DM me on Twitter, or DM me on, or you can find my email, I think, in the description, or on the NATO, on the NATO. So I'm multitasking here on the YouTube channel page. The reason I don't think, so I'm just going to quote tweet here as well, actually. What I do think is interesting is to see what will be the primary agendas of both parties on Friday. Are we going to see them come at very different angles, or are we going to see a greater consensus than we thought? The National Defense Authorization Act. All right, well, let me see here what we can do instead. It's unfortunate Amir doesn't seem to be with us. Not sure what happened to him, really. He has seen the messages, but, well, time being what it is. But what I do think is, let's look at some more updates here, actually, quickly. So, so the Iranians, according to Bloomberg, very interesting graphic here, actually, coming from Becca Wassa, the defense lead at Bloomberg, is that Iran has launched about 154 projectiles at the Gulf, not at Israel, since the ceasefire was announced. The strait remains closed, and Israel is striking Lebanon exclusively. The US may be the only party actually adhering. After all this, the US may be the only party adhering to the fragile ceasefire, at least for now. Open question of whether it holds at all, is their point. So, so they've got a very interesting graphic here. Iran has launched, initial attacks here. There seems to be a miscommunication here on Amir's side. He thinks I said 3 p.m., but I said in 3 hours. That's unfortunate. Trying to manage everything is difficult. Let me see here. So, let me see if maybe we can get David to join us earlier, and then that's a shame. You try to create a well-established, well-planned out a stream with guest on the hour for the next sort of 2 hours, and then it doesn't work. That is a bit frustrating, I won't lie, but let's continue nonetheless. So what I'm seeing here right now is that the Americans are the ones who will be, well, it's the favorite team of Witkoff and Kushner, but this time joined by Vance, who will lead the United States negotiating team in Pakistan for Iran talks starting Saturday. Saturday. So are we seeing the talks pushed back now? That's an official claim from the Americans, from the White House. That's confusing. Why are they saying Saturday if it's not? If it's meant to be for Friday? There seems to be confusion across three different areas. The Pakistanis are claiming this, the Americans are claiming that. Yeah, and the first thing that I see when I just check the BBC live stream just for updates, a disconnect in public statements between the US and Iran. We're hearing different things from the White House. For one, Levitt just made clear that from Trump's perspective, Lebanon is not included in the ceasefire, a fact she said has been conveyed to all sides of the conflict. That stands in stark contrast to what we've heard from the IRGC when they promised, quote, a regret-inducing response if strikes on Lebanon continue. Notably, the IRGC has delivered both to the oath-breaking US and to Israel. Similarly, the current status of Iran's security posture in the Strait of Hormuz remains unclear. Levitt herself said that what they're saying publicly is different privately, and the most significant unanswered question is how Iran's highly enriched uranium, which Levitt referred to as Trump's red line, will be handled, even though she said that Iran has signaled a willingness to hand the material over. So, yeah, it's odd. There seems to be a very inconsistent picture on the nuclear framing as well. On the one hand, it's a core part of the negotiations. And then on another hand, it's sort of seemingly referenced and forgotten about up and down. It seems to be very inconsistently referenced. Okay, we can be joined by David in about 15 minutes from now. So David's going to join us first, and then Amir will join us later on. Let me just get this hold of this. So we're just swapping the guests around, and then we'll do that. But we've got some exciting things actually just on the channel coming up. I'm going to be going to New York next week for an event, and it's going to be very exciting. I was actually invited as press, which is pretty crazy. But we're going to be meeting some pretty exciting characters. I don't want to spoiler it too much, or add spoilers too much, but there are a notable couple of former US administration actors and a well-known chess player, a grandmaster. So I'll let some of you speculate who some of those people might be. But that was a very exciting invitation. So we're meant to be going to New York next week. And we're also going to be hosting General Wesley Clark, former Supreme NATO Allied Commander and coordinator of who oversaw the NATO operations in Kosovo in the next couple of weeks. We also have a couple of interviews being published with Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, and working on a former member of the House of Lords here in the UK, editor-in-chief of The Spectator. That will be in late April. So we've got quite a few exciting things in the pipeline coming up as well. So if you're new to the channel, if you're new to the community, then do consider subscribing or liking the video. It helps with discovery. But let's get back to some of the details here. Let's talk about some of the latest things. Okay, interesting. So this comes from the foreign minister. This was about an hour ago. The Iran and US ceasefire terms are clear. This comes from Saeed Agrachi, the foreign minister of Iran, who would need to be taken out by the Israelis and the Americans if they were genuinely going for regime change. He would need to be, So that's a demonstration that the idea of regime change has not been met. The Iran-US ceasefire terms are clear and explicit. The US must choose ceasefire or continued war via Israel. It cannot have both. The world sees the massacres in Lebanon. The ball is in the US court, and the world is watching whether it will act on its commitments. That's a pretty well, there's no qualms about that. That's a pretty clear opinion there from the foreign minister, and that's been retweeted 14,000 times in just over an hour. I think it's just interesting to see some of the comments underneath the post. It's always entertaining. If you want a good laugh, either when you're on it, if you use Instagram, read the comments. The comments are as much of a popcorn read as the post itself, but it's the same obviously with Twitter. The way that Twitter's monetization works is it's about how many replies you get. Can you stimulate engagement based on replies? That's where the way that the monetization seems to have been created or developed. And so you get some pretty crazy replies to people, including myself. I get my own fair share of absurd replies. But yeah, there's another. Okay, so we've got an update here from Caroline Levette. Statements today, or reports today that Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz due to continued Israeli strikes are false, claiming that there has been an actual uptick of traffic in the Strait today, despite maritime tracking indicating that only two tankers transited through the Hormuz Strait on Wednesday. That's actually a significant drop since the past few days, where we saw, I think, the number of vessels transiting it entering double figures. I mean, obviously, compared to February 28th, 27th, I think it was around 150 a day. So we're still only 10%, but now we're on 2. So literally we're back to 1.5% of what is the supposed traversal or transiting of the strait. Iran's parliament speaker, who has been pretty active in combating claims or defying and disagreeing vocal, is Iran's parliament speaker says that 3 causes of the ceasefire agreement have already been violated: the ceasefire in Lebanon, drones in Iranian airspace, denial of Iran's right of nuclear enrichment. In such a situation, a bilateral ceasefire or negotiations is unreasonable. Okay, I'm just clarifying, Amir, the timing. Let's see here. We've got some other updates, I think. Yeah, this is a big deal, actually, the statements. I'll read you the full statement. Statement on the violation of 3 key clauses of the 10-point proposal or agreed framework before the start of negotiations. This deep historical distrust we hold towards the United States stems from its repeated violations of all forms of commitment, a pattern that has been regrettably repeated once again. As the president of the US has clearly stated in his Truth, the Islamic of Republics 10-point proposal is quote unquote workable basis on which to negotiate. So they are directly quoting Trump and the main framework for these talks. However, 3 clauses of this proposal have been violated so far. 1, non-compliance with the first clause of the 10-point proposal. That's what I pointed out earlier. It explicitly referenced Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. Regarding the ceasefire, a commitment that Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has also explicitly referred to and declared as, quote, an immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon and other regions, effective immediately. 2, the entry of an intruding drone into Iranian airspace, which was destroyed in the city of Lar in Fars province, in clear violation of the clause prohibiting any further violation of Iranian airspace. And 3, denial of Iran's right to enrichment, which was included in the 6th clause, that is right, of the framework. Now, the very, quote, workable foundations on which to negotiate has been openly and clearly violated even before negotiations began. In such situation, a bilateral ceasefire or negotiations is unreasonable. That's a big deal, but it doesn't necessarily mean the ceasefire is broken. It can be violated, but if both parties, because as I read earlier, the US seems to be the only country that's actually adhering to the ceasefire. If they, along with the Iranians, still continue to agree that they will to talk on Friday or Saturday or whenever it is, then in theory the ceasefire will hold. It remains to be seen what happens if we start seeing the Americans take action, and that may well change. But it's difficult to tell on that. Clearly, the Iranians are pissed. Let me just see here. A bilateral or negotiations are unreasonable. Let me see here. Broken, yes. Broken, not necessarily. Do you ever get it when you're trying to type something and the keyboard continues to sort of you misspell something, so it continues to misspell it or post the wrong word? I'll put that down there actually. Right. Well, anyway, guys. Yeah. So trying to multitask is tricky, that's for sure. But anyway, I think what we're going to do is see if David can join us shortly. There's quite a lot that I'm keen to ask him from the Israeli perspective, Lebanon, Hezbollah. And then we're going to have Amir join us in about 45 minutes, I think. Great. Right. So we've got both guys joining us soon. So no, he can't. People really don't seem to understand how NATO works. This is what I find very entertaining. So I'm just seeing here from Axios, an Israeli official told me the mediating countries were trying to convene a meeting in Islamabad with Galibaf and other officials representing Tehran, Witkoff, Kushner, and possibly J.D. Vance representing the US, possibly later this week. There seems to be a lot of possibly theirs. Interceptor drones set a March record. Oh, this is on Ukraine. Okay, we'll just read this as a slightly different, interesting factoid. Interceptor drones set a March record. 33,000 plus enemy UAVs destroyed, 2 times more than the previous month. Interceptors are Ukrainian invasion that form a core layer of the country's defense. Some of you may know the Ukrainian Zelensky has been trying to remain in the conversation, if you like, remain in the public narrative, in the public discourse over the war in Iran, and ensure that attention doesn't get deviated away from Ukraine too much by demonstrating how well placed Ukraine is as a player, as a military player, to offer assistance to the Gulf states with interception of Iran's drones and so on. So that's quite a significant development there, and I think that that's only going to continue if the Iranians continue to, or seem to be, striking Iran, the Emirates exclusively. Then that's that. And Zelensky was in Riyadh earlier last week, I believe it was, or late last week. So so it's confirmed. The White House has confirmed that the talks will be led by JD Vance on Saturday. The talks are expected to be part of the broader diplomatic efforts to secure a ceasefire with Pakistan as the mediator. Now, I think it's worth for a moment really considering the implications of this for Pakistan. They've been making a very concerted effort to be the central player. Now, we had a conversation with Vali Nasser, former dean of my university, Johns Hopkins, and he was emphasizing in his opinion that none of these players, be it Oman, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, whoever it has been referenced, has been a negotiator. They've been nothing more than a glorified sort of courier messaging between the two. I find that a little bit harsh, but I find that, I don't know if I suppose that's a fair assessment. Personally, I see it slightly differently in that they have been shuttling communications, but you have to shuttle communications with a degree of persuasion, right? Trying to encourage both sides to come round to actually engaging the other at some point. So there has to be a degree of effective communication, right? Any effective communication strategy, you have to be good at sort of conveying the points across. Certainly, I think if Trump was just negotiating directly with the Iranians, or they were literally just transferring what Trump was saying to Iran, I don't know if that would work very well in negotiations. So, I think Pakistan's going to come out of this quite well, quite favorably. They haven't had a great relationship with Iran, with the United States in recent weeks, in recent months, especially since the Trump administration took back power. So in my opinion, I think that the Pakistanis are going to be very popular in Camp Trump in the next few months. And I'm going to be interested to see what implications that has for the Indian relationship with America as well. So, a lot there to dissect as well, especially after also Trump claims that he helped negotiate that ceasefire between the Pakistanis and Indians almost a year ago in May, when they had their border clashes, which were pretty intense and a lot of people feared would collapse and escalate. So. Let me just see if David here is ready to join us. People seem to be right. Okay, so let's see here. What else is? It's one of these things that, because the United States and the military is not as involved now, the frequency and magnitude, the intensity of the conflict has definitely gone down a level. You will get arbitrary intermittent strikes between the United States, between Israel and Iran, or with Iran on, the Gulf states. But yeah, basically we're in this phase now where the Israelis are being very active in Lebanon, and the Lebanon people are suffering the most. I think there's a lot of discussion that's going to be held around the legality of or the lawfulness of the IDS operations in southern Lebanon, and whether or not it's justifiable to preemptively occupy such a large proportion of the country's territory. From my understanding, they have basically occupied all the way up to the southern border with the river, which I always forget the name of, but let's bring it up here. Okay, so this is now this is according to Al Jazeera, which I will be transparent is obviously heavily critical of Israel, and frames the situation in a particular light. But I thought this graphic is quite good. So if we share, I can add that to the stage. Great. So that's the map. But let's go to this one. That one. This one. That one. Share this tab. Yeah. So this has been in the past couple of weeks. Basically, the IDF decided to launch a significant ground offensive into southern Lebanon. I mentioned Bekaa and the Bekaa Valley earlier. That's where some of the biggest operations have occurred. And as Netanyahu said, since the pager operation, these biggest strikes, so over 250 fatalities now just in and around that area primarily. But the biggest on the ground operations has been in and around southern, all the way up to the Litani River. I always forget the name of the Litani River, but also further. So this area here is what the Israelis have ordered the Lebanese to evacuate to the north, upwards towards Beirut and Sidon, and that's where they're physically occupying effectively. Now, you do have the UN Blue Line, which is the UN mission that is operational down there and has been for 40 plus years effectively. March 12th, the Israeli army expanded its force displacement orders for residents from the Litani River to north of the Zarani River, and about 40 kilometers north of the Israeli border. So from the IDS perspective, this is about obviously creating a safe buffer zone. It's about creating enough of a buffer zone, and there's a preemptive move to protect the northern settlements of Israel from Hezbollah strikes, from Hezbollah attacks. But those critical of such actions are that it leads to a form of the Golan Heights, that Israel just simply sits there and never relinquishes that territory. And what I think is important as another example is this darker line. So this area here is the occupied Golan Heights that Israel has occupied for effectively 60 years. This darker line is the buffer zone that they established after the ousting of Bashar al-Assad late in 2024, when he was ousted by the HTS and obviously Al-Jani and the groups that now run the country effectively. The IDF decided that they would occupy an even greater part of southwestern Syria up towards Damascus, because they felt that there was a threat, an even greater threat. They didn't feel that the militant groups that were running the country, they didn't feel that the military operations of Syria or the change of the government system would mean it's safe for Israel. So they decided to extend their occupation and their presence, military footprint within Syria. So David's going to join us in just a second, and yeah, this is what I want to talk to him about. Is more of this, because a lot of people's concern is that Israel enters this country, they occupy this territory, and then at what point, if any at all, will they effectively give it back? Because it's all about protecting from Hezbollah. But if Hezbollah can't be systematically and effectively weakened, then how can you ensure that this is at what point do we establish that this is the objectives have been achieved? But David is here. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi. My apologies for the delay. It's been a crazy day, as you can imagine.
Yes, I had to ad lib for.
Sorry, I lost you on audio for some reason.
Can you hear me now? That's probably because you're connected to Spaces.
I'm not able to hear you for some reason. I don't know if you're able to hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Should I log back in and come? Okay.
It's because David's on Spaces, so he can't hear us because his phone, I think, is connected to the audio, and therefore he's multitasking. And I think that's where he was before. But the Hawaiian shirt, yes, I was keen to get Larry on actually earlier today, but he's swamped with other obviously requests. He's a very popular commentator, but I was lucky enough to be able to host him when we did. This is sorry. It's quite tricky trying to manage all this single-handedly. Right. Hi, David. Can you hear me?
Now I can. Yes, perfect.
Yes, it's because you were connected to Spaces. You need to remove yourself from that if you want to be on the live stream, because it uses your audio and your phone.
Sure.
But it's great to meet you. I have been talking for a good 45 minutes, so I'm a bit thirsty and parched now. But I'm very interested to get your thoughts on all the developments right now. You are a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, a notable think tank, and I guess obviously the main flashpoint right now is Lebanon. It's a sticking point. There's lots of different aspects, angles that I want to get your take on, and I'm sure we'll have a back and forth on certain details. But right now Lebanon has suffered around 1,500 fatalities, 250 in the biggest operation since the Pyotr operation in 2024, which took out Nasrallah. So, what is the motivations of Israel to make such big moves today? Is it because of the ceasefire? Were they planning such an operation right now? What are you hearing? What's your thoughts?
Well, what's interesting, you asked this because I'm currently editing a piece that I have to edit it backwards, because what I said there, and I'd written this piece about a week and a half ago, that once the Iran front went silent, however it went silent, based on Israeli statements, based on Israeli moves in Lebanon, it was always predictable we were going to see this escalation in Lebanon. Now, I initially thought you'd see a ground incursion immediately, but I think the Israelis are continuing to soften up the territory, so to speak, when it comes to Hezbollah's assets ahead of that ground invasion. So I think what we had seen from March or when the war started in Iran, the primary focus, and there was a report in Axios, I think early on after the Lebanon front had opened up, the Prime Minister Netanyahu had given a directive to the IDF to continue prioritizing the war in Iran. And I think there are two reasons there. Obviously, first, Iran is the bigger threat, if not the more immediate threat, to the Israeli home front in terms of the ballistic missiles and so on. And the second reason is U.S. involvement, both on the the positive side of that, and that you can't leave your most major ally hanging when it comes to such a major operation and take care of. I would disagree that Lebanon is a side theater, but the perception in American and Israeli military planning was that it was a side theater. And second, because the Lebanon war, I don't think there's an inherent clock that's running down on it, right? Whereas with Iran, from the outset, it was always obvious to anyone, including Israeli military planners, that they had their heads screwed on straight, that the Iran war couldn't last indefinitely, that it had a clock running on it, and that clock was not in Jerusalem, it was in Washington. So you need to accomplish as much as possible on the Iranian front before you turn full force to Lebanon. And look, the Israeli Air Force is powerful, perhaps one of the most powerful in the world, but it is a small air force overall. The Israeli army is small, and even a ground invasion in Lebanon would have taken away logistics and resources and military planning away from the bigger and more finite campaign in Iran. So you saw this, this kind of this Israeli escalation at the outset, but it was obvious that the Israelis had not brought their full power to force or to bear in Lebanon, and then that would happen once the Iran front went silent. However, it went silent. Now we see, this potential ceasefire. That's on the Israeli side. On the Iranian side, again, this is Iran's Hezbollah. The war in Lebanon is against Hezbollah primarily, and this is Iran's most powerful proxy. This isn't just a theoretical thing. This isn't Hezbollah serves a practical Iranian need, in that if we look at all of Iran's regional expansionism over the past decades, right? Hezbollah was there first. Iraq, when we invaded Iraq, Hezbollah came in on our coattails to help build up the Shiite militias that now dominate, or predominate at least, in Iraqi national politics, and that killed many American soldiers. Yemen, building up the Houthis, building up opposition forces in Bahrain, and let's not forget, obviously, Syria. The Iranian regime had deemed that an existential threat to the regime at home, and Hezbollah was the first to fight there. So if you lose Hezbollah, you've lost a critical, if not the most critical actor in the resistance axis. So what Iran is trying to do now, they obviously can't make the Israelis stop in Lebanon. The Israelis conventionally have the upper hand, and they don't want to continue absorbing blows domestically. I think they're messaging to Washington that, hey, if you where the ceasefire with Iran seems to carry a lot of value for President Trump personally. Midterm elections coming up, and this has not impacted President Trump's numbers favorably. And I think what the Iranian messaging now is that if Lebanon is not silenced, if the Lebanon front is not silenced, then the whole edifice will fall apart, in the hopes that Washington will get Israel to stop in Lebanon, just like it has gotten Israel to stop in Iran.
So let me give you sort of one framing that I've seen developing, right? And then you can share your take on that. But there's been a lot of back and forth about whether or not this was the war would eventually peter out between the US and Iran. It was pretty clear that the US government wanted a way to wind down, off ramp, change the overall circumstances, and I think that's because we've seen a shift over time over the claimed strategic / military objectives. Quite clearly, the three that were laid out by the Joint Chiefs of Staff earlier, a couple of them were not mentioned at the outset of this conflict. It was about regime change, and since it's been refined or altered, the messaging is being clarified or claimed it was never like that, etc. But in all of this, Israel was always going to, I think, be different, and people argue that even if the United States agrees a long-term settlement or some kind of armistice with Iran, there's going to be operations with Israel because of the people that are running the country. Netanyahu has always had a long desire to deal decisive blows, and that's not without getting into discussion around the ultra-nationalist components that keep his government in power. So, are we just seeing what was inevitable with this, or do you think that this is because the Israelis don't think that it has gone far enough and they need to act for their own existential preservation or whatever?
What are you saying when it comes to Lebanon, or when it comes to the Iranian?
Lebanon, but also the few strikes that have been occurring over towards Iran, because there have been strikes to Iran as well.
So my understanding is that it's not the Israelis, unless something has come in. I've been preoccupied with media. But my understanding is that it seems like the strikes that are going on in Iran were conducted by Mirage 2000 fighters, which the Israelis don't have in their arsenal, to the best of my knowledge.
Is that the UAE?
Presumably the UAE. They're the closest country with them in their arsenal, and even if the Israelis haven't flown Mirages since the Six-Day War, if I'm not mistaken. And even if they did, right, there's no way for them. They don't have the ability to get into Iranian airspace. So my presumption is perhaps it's coming from other countries who are still being targeted. I mean, I think Kuwait, the UAE. I can't remember if Saudi Arabia today was also targeted by Iranian attacks. But when it comes to the Lebanon front, look, the Iranian front, I get the argument, but if we look back to June, the June war, the so-called 12-day war, Israeli involvement in Iran, and this was kind of surprising to me, was always going to implicate the United States. And I say surprising because the Israeli national ethos is get it done by yourself, right? The Israeli national ethos up until that point was, there's this, and this is informed by Jewish history, that you can't rely on outsiders, even great friends, to take care of existential threats for you. And so while Israel didn't have the apparent capabilities or the most direct capabilities to, say, destroy Fordo or to damage Fordo, I imagine they would have come up with some kind of alternative that would have obviated the need to rely on external powers if, the moment of truth came. Money time, as the Israelis say, quite literally, and they didn't have the, and that help, that external help, was not forthcoming. It seems like that didn't happen, and it implicated U.S. involvement, and this is something that the Iranians can always play to get the Americans to pressure. Like, they understand conventionally they can't fight the Israelis. The Israelis have the upper hand, conventionally speaking, even if not numerically, not other types of weapons. And so what you do is, if you can't stop Israel directly through military confrontation, you put pressure or leverage on the country that can. Or on the actor that can, in this case, the United States, which has been in an isolationist mood on both the left and the right. We see a growing isolationism for some time. We saw this in Syria. It manifested when it came to the Ukraine war. And now, since the Gaza war has gone on and on, even many of Israel's friends on the right have turned against it because my sense is, at the bottom, they don't want the United States implicated. Now, when it comes to Iran, obviously, because of its size, because of its power, because of just the kind of the weight of the name Iran, there's always this implication. So the Israelis are ultimately, right, the United States is involved even if it's not involved, and the United States is going to weigh in on Israeli operations even if it's not involved, just like we saw in the June war when Trump said, "You're done," right? And the Israelis called back planes mid-flight, even after they suffered a strike in Beersheba, a missile strike in Beersheba, and landed those planes. With Lebanon, it's different because there's no U.S. implication, in the sense that the Israelis have the capability to take on the threats from Lebanon, even if not to destroy Hezbollah entirely. The IDF has said that it's beyond Israel's capability to occupy the territory in Lebanon necessary to entirely destroy Hezbollah. Again, unsurprising. And aerial campaigns cannot finish the job. But there's no implication of U.S. involvement. And I think this gives Israel a lot more leeway. So while the two fronts are symbiotic from the Israeli perspective, they're also separate from that point of view that the United States is not going to put the brakes on this. And we saw this throughout this, the reignition of the third Lebanon conflict. This is, after all, a continuation of the war that started on October 8th of 2023, where Lebanese officials went to their previous interlocutor with the United States, Tom Barrack, and there's a report in Axios, and they said, we want direct negotiations with the Israelis, and it was misreported that they wanted peace negotiations. Really what they wanted was return to the status quo ante. And Tom Barrack said, cut the bullshit. I think that's the quote in Axios. He's like, unless you're going to act on Hezbollah, actually act, not words. I'm tired of words. Unless you're going to actually act, we're not interested. And we've seen that U.S. disinterest in what happens in Lebanon continue. And what Iran is trying to do now is get the United States interested in Lebanon, is trying to get the United States feel that it is implicated in the war in Lebanon and its continuation, while the Israelis are looking at this as, separate. And again, from another angle, is something perhaps most people tend to not realize, because of Hezbollah's linkage to Iran and its dependency on Iran, or upon Iran. Even if the regime were to fall tomorrow, Hezbollah would be able to survive because it was designed to survive past the regime. It would not remain the same organization. It would have to deal with a new reality, but it would survive. So the Israelis always looked at this as a symbiotic but ultimately separate front, and Iran is trying to couple them in its new permutation, if you will, of its unification of the fronts.
So just to pick up on that last point then, as a comparison, as a comparative analysis, the decapitation strategy that was undertaken by both in Iran has not yielded the intended or perhaps most optimal results, right? You can argue that you've taken out a large proportion of the political leadership of the Islamic Republic. However, the IRGC is largely still, fully functional, to be honest with you. You've lost a few senior officers. The Artesh, the Besieged movement, still largely untouched. The judicial system, the security forces, i.e. the police and so on, all these factors still remain. So if you're not going to see an effective decapitation strategy against Iran, how can we guarantee that an effective decapitation is possible against Hezbollah?
So again,
Israel have to go? No, just to say, but how far does Israel have to go before we can sort of say that Hezbollah has been sufficiently incapacitated?
Well, that's a good question. I think, look, when it came to Iran, those who imagined that the elimination of Khamenei or the senior officials alone would bring the regime to its knees were, I don't know, selling fictions, delusional, however you want to put it. This is a regime that has been around for 50 years. It came in a country that has experienced regime change. I mean, the Pahlavis whom they deposed came in having deposed the Qajars before them. So this is a country that understands regime change, and they put into power or put into place apparatuses like the IRGC, like the Basij, that would ultimately try to minimize the chances as much as possible, because nothing can be fully prevented, of this regime suffering the fate that it brought upon its predecessor, in which its predecessor brought upon its predecessor. So this is a sophisticated regime. This is a country. This is not my grandma's book club, as I've been trying to say to people. And those who looked at it otherwise, I think, were selling fantasies that this regime, look, we hear the talk of the Iranian people opposing this regime. I think it's very hard to tell what percentage of the Iranian people do or don't oppose the regime. I think it's immaterial at this point. This regime does have grassroots support. Otherwise, it would have collapsed a long time ago. Now we're seeing this, I don't know what degree of grassroots, but insufficient grassroots support to hold on to power. Now, when you go to Hezbollah, it's something similar. Again, Hezbollah is an organization that is 40 years old officially now. It is an organization that, again, is rooted in the people. It's not, we have this problem in the West often when it comes to these types of actors, whether it's autocratic regimes or terrorist organizations, to make the assumption that they don't have grassroots support, that the people over whom they rule are would-be Americans, over whom these Martians have come and placed their rule. And if only you would degrade these Martians, these aliens, sufficiently, the people would rise up and oppose them. Except what we've seen when it comes to Hezbollah is, the support. Right? Why is this war happening to begin with in Lebanon? Not to go on too long of a historical tangent, but Lebanon was supposed to disarm Hezbollah. Even before this, but ultimately, in a concentrated manner, the international community passed Resolution 1701 in 2006, said, Lebanon, you have to disarm Hezbollah effectively. And this was based on Lebanese government proposal at the time, the 7 points of the Senora government. There were 18 years between Resolution 1701 and October 8th of 2023, when Hezbollah restarted the conflict, during which Lebanon did nothing against Hezbollah. Now, why? And then, after November 27th of 2024, 15 months forward, Lebanon did nothing against Hezbollah. Again, the question is, why? Is it because Hezbollah rules with the fist? No, it also has considerable popular support among Lebanese Shiites, who most likely, we don't know because Lebanon hasn't had a credible census since 1932, and even that one was questionable. But Lebanese Shiites form at least 1/3 of the country, and the country is set up similarly to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I like to explain to people that it's not a unified body. It is a body over whom these different equally legitimate components, sects in this case, are vying for a piece of the pie, similar to how you have with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? Is the Roman Catholic or the Orthodox claim more legitimate? That's for Christendom to decide. And in Lebanon, is the Shiite claim any less legitimate than the Maronite claim to the country? And to the extent that we can speak of a unified, Shiite or Maronite claim. So the way you apportion power in Lebanon is to the most powerful representatives of these sects, right? To kind of maintain this sectarian power sharing. And in this case, Hezbollah has become the predominant political party among Lebanese Shiites. Why? Because the way Lebanese Shiites have been convinced, rightly and wrongly, is that Hezbollah is their guarantor of domestic equality in Lebanon against the Maronites and against the Druze and against the Sunnis. Traditionally, the Lebanese Shiites were considered this disenfranchised, lower echelon segment of Lebanese society, and their former leaders basically kept them in that state, in contradistinction to other Lebanese sectarian leaders with their sects. And comes in Hezbollah, says we're going to empower the entire community, right? There's a price for it, obviously. And they also view Hezbollah as their guarantor against external threats, namely Takfiri terrorists and the Israelis. And the Israelis have not done themselves many favors when it comes to impacting Shiite public opinion when it comes to this. So when you say we're going to disarm Hezbollah, right, you're not just confronting a finite terrorist organization, you're confronting an organization that is perceived by a broad swath of Lebanese society, a legitimate swath of Lebanese society, as the only thing between them and oblivion. And this is something that Hezbollah has emphasized over the years. So that could lead to civil war if you go to take out Hezbollah, right? Because every Shiite, whether they're an ideologue or not, and most of Hezbollah's supporters are not, this ends up in civil war. So no possibility of Lebanon, right? This remains the case now, that Lebanon is not going to take care of the Hezbollah problem, and Israel can't fully take care of the Hezbollah problem. So there's an intermediary factor, or intermediary solution that the Israelis are settling upon. It's not decapitation. Decapitation is part of it, right? What we're seeing is that the Israelis have been going after during this round, even though it's more intense than mid-September to November 27, 2024, they're going after mid-level commanders. Because I think what they're trying to do is look, you go after Naim Qassem, you go after Mohammed Rad, you go after these senior figureheads. Yeah, that impacts the organization, but it doesn't cripple the military apparatus's ability to function. That's where you go after the mid-level commanders, and they're trying to box Hezbollah into the southern Litani area. So what I see the Israelis doing, this is what they've talked about, going up to the southern Litani area, occupying that for some time, and then moving back to a more digestible territory. And what we've seen from reports that Israeli military planning is focusing on something to 2 to 3 kilometers. It's not a solution to Hezbollah. But if the Israelis do this new revived security zone right, it can become a platform from which to continuously degrade Hezbollah from this security zone, not just with air power, but with ground operations, with ongoing ground operations, until such time as perhaps Lebanon feels secure enough. Because again, there are two factors here. When it comes to Lebanon's ability to confront Hezbollah. There's the popular support, but there's also the military element, right? That Hezbollah retains enough power militarily for the LAF's attempts to disarm it to be daunting or potentially.
I just to chime in on that point. I mean, we've had David Petraeus on the show before, and obviously someone who is incredibly important in the encouragement, adoption of things like people-centric approaches to coin or counterinsurgency ops is obviously a core component to all of that. But it's good to have someone who, from your perspective on, because we often get people of differing perspectives across the political spectrum, and people who might be more on a restraint emphasis, or will argue that, is it justifiable for Israel to be potentially jeopardizing peace talks between the US and Iran because of their interests in Lebanon? And is there not a less destructive way to manage Hezbollah? Because the strikes we've seen today around the Bekaa Valley, if I'm saying that right, that's 250 people have been killed, 1,500 casualties altogether. That's a significant hit for a country the size of 6 million people. That's yeah. So how do you argue this? How do you frame this? And what the Netanyahu's government achievements are?
Look, I think there are a lot of moving parts here, but let me start with breaking them down. The hearts and minds component that General Petraeus is talking about. I think the Israelis have much more limited capability in actively influencing Lebanese Shiite population, because that's ultimately where the rest of Lebanon already. We see statistics, right, show that 70% of Lebanese want Hezbollah disarmed in some fashion, right? To some degree they agree with this, but until Hezbollah loses the Shiites, that 70% doesn't matter, because it's not right, the calculus that we talked about is not relative to the rest of Lebanon, it's relative to the rest of the Shiite population. What we've seen there, latest statistics, right? I remember a poll from September of 2024, something like 85% of Lebanese Shiites continue to support Hezbollah to some degree, and 5% don't, right? So Israel's ability to grow that number, I think, is limited. But that does not mean that the Israelis, right there, so there's a positive angle or a proactive angle that I think is beyond Israel's capability, because it does not have the kind of the cultural influence of the United States. It doesn't have, right, Israel is viewed in a certain way that's, that the United States isn't viewed in the region, including in Lebanon. I mean, most Lebanese Shiites are probably, not anti-American. I mean, maybe they're hostile, they oppose certain American policies, but I think the average Lebanese, whether they're in the Shiite community or outside, does not view America as an illegitimate country, does not view America as, worthy of destruction and so on and so forth. The average Lebanese has no strong feelings, no strong positive feelings towards Israel. And again, rightly and wrongly in some cases. But Israel's ability to impact that is much more limited than the United States. But that does not preclude the Israelis from not doing, if I may, stupid shit, and saying stupid shit. And this actually has impact on Israel's military operations and how it's perceived in the Shiite community and in the rest of Lebanon, right? We talked about how if you look at Hezbollah's supporters, only a core are ideologues. They're Khomeinists, they're religious, they're committed to the ideology no matter what. As you go out from that, most people are flexible, even if they're religious, even if they're not, right? They're flexible on the question of Israel. Maybe they hate Israel, maybe they don't like Israel, but they don't want to fight Israel. And I think that's something for the Israelis to work with if they play it right. And Hezbollah has taken Israel's missteps in the past, and let's put it that way, and turned it into this idea that, Lebanese Shiites, Lebanese writ large, but particularly Lebanese Shiites, you need us because this rapacious enemy is at your door that wants to steal your territory gratuitously and kill you gratuitously, right? So every time you feed into that, then and also coincidentally, by the by, we are also the only entity that can deter and keep this rapacious enemy at bay. So to the extent that Israel feeds into that with statements like, annexing south of the Litani River, and the Israelis, look, there's the bombast of war that the Israelis are increasingly given to the growing Middle Easternization of Israel's politics, but that's counterproductive because that element underscores, or kind of reaffirms Hezbollah's narrative. So, what the Israelis need to do, there's two elements here of breaking Hezbollah's resistance narrative, which is one of the primary fixtures of its ability to draw support from Lebanese Shiites. First, you need to show that Hezbollah is incapable of deterring Israel. So you don't do what you did in 1985 to 2000 or 2006 and not fight a war, right? You fight the war. You fight the war against Hezbollah. You go after them. You show that Israel is setting the terms of the conflict, the tempo of the conflict, the red lines that Hezbollah. I mean, when we look at the vast majority of the history of the Hezbollah-Israel conflict, Hezbollah has set the red lines, right? They have been able to set the red lines until September 16th, when the pager operation happened, until November 27th of 2024, and subsequent to that. Only in that period has Israel set the red line. So that shows that Hezbollah is ineffective. Now what you need to show is they're unnecessary. And that comes through messaging, right? Messaging, both militarily, you try to assiduously avoid civilian casualties to the extent possible, right? Obviously, it's not going to be easy, but you try to avoid the unnecessary as much as possible. You try to minimize as much as possible. And then your messaging needs to be, right, focusing on, you can't say on the one hand, our war is not with the Lebanese people, and then have senior members of the cabinet talking about annexing 1/3 of Lebanon and depopulating it. That is insane. And these two things work at cross ends, and it impacts the military's operations because, on the other hand, Hezbollah will remain strengthened, people will say, well, we have no even if Hezbollah isn't effective, we have no option but Hezbollah. Now we talk about less destruction. Yeah.
If I could just chime in on that point, because I think, a lot of what you're saying is very compelling, but again, I'll offer the opposing consideration, which is that people fear that, Israel or the IDF will occupy that territory, and become a little bit under international, a bit of a belligerent occupant. as we've seen with the Golan Heights, which is heavily criticized internationally. But also, as you joined, I was taking through the audience the shifts that they made in expanding that buffer zone beyond the Golan Heights when the HTS coalition, whatever, took over Damascus, and then Al-Jani came into power and all that sort of stuff, because they were fearful about Syria becoming a terrorist state or a hub for Al-Qaeda, etc., affiliates and all that. They still occupy that additional buffer zone. So people, I guess, worry that, is Israel effectively just going to stay in southern Lebanon? And because these objectives are quite difficult to obtain, or as you said, they're quite tricky to fully implement, does it effectively mean it's an operation without an end point, a time horizon that has an end goal?
I think, look, I would separate Syria and Lebanon. I think, I've publicly been very critical of how the Israelis have mishandled their hand in Syria, because you have a population. I mean, this should be Israel's dream, right? An Arab population that is indifferent to you, right? Now, I mean, the idea of and indifference can be the starting point of more positive relations. And the Syrian people, look, Julani is shut out, whatever his intentions internally. Again, this is a man who came to power off of the back of the lesson of the Arab Spring. If there was one lesson, it's that even autocrats can't go too far out of lockstep with their people without losing power. And I think Shara wants to remain in power. And if the Syrian people's sentiment is, we don't want war. And I have a friend of mine who's Syrian American who went back to visit Damascus for the first time since the conflict. And he showed me footage of Damascus that is indistinguishable from the worst parts of Gaza, from the rest of the country. And this is something the regime hid for a very long time. Syrians want normalcy. Syrians, and not to say the Lebanese don't, right? But you have an actor, and I think Shara, realizing that his head remaining firmly attached to his shoulders depends on, the Syrian people believing that he also wants normalcy. So again, whatever his intentions, I think there was a way for the Israelis to handle that assured the Syrian people, again, that they're not trying to fragment up the country, that they're not trying to play the ethno-sectarian game in the country, and that would not turn the overwhelming majority of Syrians who are Syrian Arab against them and let them and lead them to perceive that, Israel is trying to strangle their first chance of hope in 70 years, if not more, in its infancy. Now, when it comes to Lebanon, look, you have an active actor in Lebanon. I think most Lebanese realize this is a distinction, right? The Syrians can look and say, we got rid of Assad. We got rid of the Iranians. We're not bothering you. We're not thinking about you. We don't want war with you. Why are you here? Right? Whereas with Lebanon, conversely, right, it's the inverse. It's, we get it. We don't like you, right? You're breaking our country apart. You're doing a lot of damage, but we kind of get why you're here. And we're seeing that even from the upper echelons of government, that there is sort of an understanding that, look, if we, the Lebanese, don't take care of it, then someone else is going to. And unfortunately, this is how such a problem is taken care of. But now this is where it comes to the Israelis to, again, manage the messaging properly. Hezbollah has demonstrated it has no intention of disarming, right? The Lebanese government took out a decision or issued a decision on March 2nd proscribing Hezbollah's military activities. Hezbollah said, take it and, put it somewhere. We're not abiding by this. And Wafiq Safa, senior Hezbollah official, is saying, we're going to force the government to rescind this decision once there's a ceasefire. And by all indications, because the factors that existed on August 14th of 2006, the factors that existed on November 27th of 2024, those military and social factors we talked about, because they, by all indications, they continue to exist, it seems like Hezbollah is going to be able, if the Israelis take away pressure, Hezbollah is going to be able to force Lebanon to rescind that decision and continue regeneration, as we've seen over the past 15 months. Now, this puts Israel in the position where, yes, it is going to have to engage in a long-term occupation. And this is where messaging comes in. This is where messaging now comes in, where, this government must, I mean, I don't know how, I don't know if any of them are listening to me or they're going to listen to me. Obviously, this is me talking into the wind when it comes to that. But they must right now engage in message discipline, right? Where they're making it clear the objectives are military, the objectives are focused on Hezbollah. And look, if we even talk realistically, all this bombastic talk of depopulating the southern Litani area and not letting, Lebanese return 600,000, if not more Lebanese return to their homes in most of this area indefinitely. The IDF simply can't do that. We're talking about an army that's about 635,000 total personnel. This includes the entertainment troops and the cooks, right? If we look at the combat personnel, the IDF is much, much smaller. And it has a manpower shortage. And the manpower that it does have has been exhausted by, the IDF's doctrine focuses on sharp, decisive, quick, and overwhelming campaigns, not on 3-year campaigns. I can't think of a time where the IDF has fought for 3 years straight. Right? Maybe the war of attrition in the Sinai, but that was, again, finite and very limited. Something like this is unprecedented for the IDF. There's a manpower shortage. This is why we see all this tension in Israel over the ultra-Orthodox recruitment. And Israel still has to remain committed on multiple fronts that, as far, whether realistically or not, the Israelis perceive threats from them. So to say that Israel is going to be able to digest southern Lebanon in its entirety, let alone going up to Dahiyeh and the Bekaa Valley and all the way up to Hermel, where Hezbollah is, where its strongholds are, retaining hostile territory indefinitely. It's way beyond the IDF's capabilities. So what the IDF can realistically do is what we're seeing them do now, right? They're creating a manageable battle space in southern Lebanon. They're breaking the bridges between the southern Litani area and the northern Litani area to prevent Hezbollah from bringing in personnel, or complicate at least Hezbollah's ability to bring in personnel, bring in materiel, and from there, do what the LAF claimed to have done on January 8th of 2026, which is to clear Hezbollah of the area. After that, right, that could take 3, 4 months, 5 months, perhaps. That's manageable for the IDF. After that,
why? Sorry, David, but if I can just interject on that point, why? How can this work though? If they're not going to go up to the Hezbollah strongholds because they don't have the physical or whatever manpower to do so, how can we therefore guarantee that this is an effective campaign if they're only going to be focusing on the southern things, or is it mainly about how? Okay, you said earlier they want to move middle rank officers, but if there's a lot of middle rank officers in the northeastern part of Lebanon, then how we know aerial strikes alone do not do enough of a job to remove political system. So how can we guarantee that what the Israel is planning to do is going to be sufficient?
Well, again, there's no guarantee. But what I see the Israelis doing, look, there was the security zone, and this is where I was going, falling back from the southern Litani area, as we saw, by the way, in 1983 to 1985, to this more digestible security zone, a buffer zone. But the mistake then between 1985 and 2000, where they retained this buffer zone, was to treat it as just a buffer zone. Now, why is that? Part of this is because 1982 happened, right? The Israeli invasion into Lebanon was supposed to be a 2-day incursion, 40 kilometers. And this is what was sold to the Israeli public and by most reports, the Israeli prime minister, to remove the PLO from southern Lebanon, right? The Israelis go beyond that because of this backroom deal between Bashir Gemayel and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, who had sold the Israelis on this idea, well, if you crown me as president of Lebanon, I will make peace between Israel and Lebanon. The Israelis did their part. Bashir Gemayel then tells them, well, actually, I have a lot of Muslims in this country that wouldn't be too happy with me being seen with you. So maybe an economic deal for now. And then he was killed. And then the objectives of the war, right? Sabr Shatila happens. The outcome of the war, Israeli casualties, had made the 1982 Lebanon war very unpopular, made any operation in Lebanon very unpopular among Israelis, right? There's a 400,000 person protest in what was then Kings of Israel Square after the Sabr Shatila massacre, saying, why are we even in this country? Why are we participants in this? Why are we overseeing the slaughter of Palestinians by Lebanese? So this invasion happens, right? Behind the Israeli rear, Hezbollah emerges. So it precludes a total IDF withdrawal. But Israeli public opinion, conversely, precludes the IDF from military decision, from pursuing military decisions. So the South Lebanon security zone becomes a mere buffer zone. The Israelis, right, their advantage is in mobility, in combined arms maneuvers, in hitting hard and fast, as we talked about. They end up hunkering down in outposts because they need to maintain the presence, but they can't go after Hezbollah. And they rely then instead on the Southern Lebanon Army, which, if you ask me, was a terrorist organization, right, in terms of its behavior. And on top of that, it was ineffective. So the Israelis, rather than deploying in South Lebanon along lines to protect the Galilee, right, which is the ostensible purpose of the security zone, went into static defense in ways to protect the SLA, this proxy of theirs. Now, this security zone can be done differently if there's no reliance on local Lebanese, and I think that's going to be the case. And again, if it is not just a buffer zone, if Israel takes a digestible part of Lebanese territory, uses that as a buffer zone, but not only that, but from there continues to launch raids, ground incursions, the operations that we've seen that Hezbollah can't withstand when it comes to Israel, also with ongoing standoff firepower operations. Like if I see the Israelis doing this correctly, I actually put out a tracker on Longwar Journal that's been following every Israeli operation, every Israeli action from the date of the ceasefire until it broke down on March 2nd. And what you see is along the blue line, right, in this kind of this call it a military targeting zone, evacuations or whatever, kill zone. There's been ongoing policing operations, patrols, incursions, sniper fire, quadcopters, right, drone strikes. Basically, any movement that the Israelis don't like, they hit it. So if I were the Israelis, again, you move up to the Litani River, you spend the next 4 months cleaning it up. Then you take those policing operations and you move them. You don't keep your troops there, right? But you keep the policing operations at the Litani River, and anything that's suspicious, you hit with whatever's necessary. And from you have the ongoing airstrikes and targeted killing and strikes on Hezbollah's assets. You can intensify those. And you couple that with ground incursions, ground raids into Hezbollah's territory, commando raids, right? This needs to be an ongoing process to where you can tilt the scales where it comes to Hezbollah, to where the Lebanese can say, all right, we at least feel secure enough that the LAF can take on Hezbollah right now. This is not going to be a 1-year process or a 2-year process. I think this is going to be Israel's only way to attempt to degrade Hezbollah faster than it can regenerate. And I see them going not just for, again, standoff firepower, but coupling that with using this security zone as a launch pad for ground incursions. More limited ground incursions, but ground incursions nonetheless.
So we're going to be joined by our next guest in a few minutes. So I'd love to get your take, a quick take on a couple of forward-looking items. Firstly, you mentioned the United States and that this should be within their interests to get involved. Mm-hmm. Would they really? And in what capacity? Primarily through a sort of logistical form, or would they actually send special forces? Would they be bombing campaigns? Like what role do you think the US could get involved or should get involved?
Oh, so no, it's in the U.S. interest, but the United States should absolutely not get involved. And I say it's in the U.S. interest because Hezbollah has primarily put the United States as its number one enemy, right? The way they describe Israel is a forward military base. It's a tool of the United States in their narrative. And Hezbollah says this in their 1985 open letter, that every war and every confrontation in which Hezbollah engages is measured against this, its yardstick is this grand confrontation with the United States. And we've seen them put this into action, both with their attacks in Lebanon and, their attacks against U.S. assets, their ability to kind of raise up Shia militias that are loyal to Iran, to pressure the United States in the region, to expel ultimately the United States from the region, not just our forces. They want the total elimination of American presence from the region. And again, this isn't some comical claim that, they want to nuke the United States. What I think they want to do, right, they have this alliance with other countries like Russia, like North Korea, like Venezuela. We'll see how Venezuela works out, but China, that all have an interest in the degradation of U.S. hegemony, right? And so if you can push the United States out of a resource-rich and critical region to trade, critical allies like the Middle East, you've weakened the United States. And from there, with these other allies, you can push the United States out of these respective regions. So we see the Iranians working with the Russians when it comes to Ukraine. Then it's no longer Washington that's dictating to Tehran. Ultimately, this alliance down the line can ultimately dictate to Washington. So, and Hezbollah is the tip of the spear of this grand Iranian regional project. So that's why I say there's a primary U.S. interest, both because Hezbollah has put us more than the Israelis in their crosshairs, and because they've acted both militarily and in other ways to eject us from the region. We shouldn't underestimate Hezbollah's activities that aren't kinetic against U.S. interests in the region. And well, if I'm saying this is a primary U.S. interest, then why not U.S. involvement? because we have a partner that can take care of it, right? There's a reason why we give the Israelis $3.8 billion a year and all this joint training and all this supply, right? For them to be able to take care of the problems, to obviate the need for our forces to be on the ground. That's the utility of an ally. And the Israelis have the capability and the willingness to do it within Lebanon. So I think rather than, we should back this campaign in the right ways until we see a Lebanese option as well, a credible Lebanese option, and then we can back that as well. But insofar as one is lacking right now, this is all we have. And it obviates, again, it takes care of a U.S. interest without having U.S. involvement on the ground. I think the less U.S. involvement in the region, the better, if you ask me. We have allies that we arm, that we support, and they should be, we should back them to take care of the job rather than us being involved directly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a big picture take, isn't it? I've made this point a few times on the show. The argument that the war against Iran is part of a grand strategy to undermine China. Personally, I find that a bit far-fetched. I just don't think that the Trump administration has such a long-framed chess mind, to be honest with you. I mean, could be wrong.
Or that thinks even now in grand strategic terms, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. People are saying that when he's going crazy over the weekend by saying crazy bastards and fuck this, fuck that, excuse me, that's all part of a negotiation strategy. That doesn't sound like someone who is he sounds unhinged. And this isn't just because of my dislike for Trump. I just don't think that that's a very effective form of diplomatic statecraft. I think objectively there are more effective ways to encourage the capitulation or whatever, agreement to bring people around to your side, right? But aside from that, there is a bunch of actors here which I am interested for your quick take on, and obviously in the US. So two related questions is, firstly, how does this work for Europe? Trump's meeting Mark Rutte, the General Secretary, as we speak, and he's going to try and withdraw from NATO, which doesn't work like that, but he's going to threaten to do that. Where does Europe stand in this? The French have some assets in the region. Britain should have had assets around Cyprus. The Greeks, Turkey. What does this all mean for Europe? And this other question is simply, where do you see this going, given the relationship of the Democrats or the left in the United States, and how likely they'll respond to Trump's war in the midterms and stuff? That's going to make it hard for Israel, isn't it?
I mean, well, yeah, that's the more complicated part. And I don't think just from the left. Look, when it comes to Europe, I think this goes back to the point that you just made about grand strategy, right? There is a grand strategy to some degree on the other side between this alliance of the, I don't know what you want to call them, the autocratic, to gradually break U.S. global hegemony and from there eject us from various regions. You're right. I don't think the Trump administration looks at this, even though there is an American interest in all of these regions, and I would say including in the Middle East, we're not looking at it that way. And if we were looking at it that way, look, our most successful campaign that we've ever had, kind of the basis of this idea, what led America to be a superpower, was World War II. And we accomplished that. We were able to succeed. Were we the tip of the spear? Were we the deciding factor? Absolutely. But we would not have been able to fight that war to success, to military decision, to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan without the assistance of our allies, right? The Canadians, the Australians, the British, the Free French. So, but there was an understanding then, and of course, we want to give credit to the Soviets where credit is deserved. But there was an understanding then about what the joint threat was and how to deal with it properly. We did not engage in coalition building prior to this campaign. And look, Iran is not a small territory. 90 million people. Tehran is larger than New York, right? You can bomb parts of Tehran and other parts of Tehran can continue to function as if nothing is happening because of the size of the city. So when we're talking about, deposing this regime, I don't know how we thought we could do this without building this grand coalition where we all do have an interest, right? I mean, if the United States is weakened, and this is something the French, I can take them to task for, they've always done this, including during the Cold War, right? The United States was giving this umbrella through NATO to protect Western Europe from the Soviet incursion and Soviet influence. The French were always doing their own thing that ultimately undermine the United States, and they still do this, right? But which ultimately undermine them. So, but the interest here is the same, whether the French have their own way of doing things, and we see this in Lebanon, whether the Israelis are kind of cutting their own deals or doing their own thing, that, if it's some way it undermines the United States, all of our allies lose. All of our allies are harmed. That does not mean we're going to do everything smartly, but at least you're secure if the United States is hegemonic. So impressing this upon our allies, taking the time leading up to this conflict to have built a coalition, at least, hey, Germany, you do this, France, you do this, UK, we need you to do this, where we are all working in concert. I mean, at least for God's sake, to have kept the Straits of Hormuz open, right? Which was the leverage, the only real leverage that Iran had over us, because they realized it's going to impact the average person. So I think that was what was lacking here. It does not mean that the European interest isn't implicated, right? They're damaged just as much if our influence in the Middle East recedes, if Iran's influence in the Middle East rises, because they're part of our camp. And how it comes to, but again, that's a failure on us for not having brought our allies on board in the proper way leading up to this campaign. As to what the effect will be on Israel, look. I don't think it's only going to come from the left. I think we see rising voices on the right for whom this is going to be grist for their mill. And unfortunately, it seems like, look, a cornerstone of this war was regime change. And as we know, regime change does not happen from the air. It needs movement on the ground. And there was a narrative that was sold that if you but bring in, the cavalry, the people will rise up and tear down the regime. And 40 days, that's not happened. Now, could it happen tomorrow? Probably, but it's unlikely. And I think the assessment that it seems like there were certain interest groups that sold this to the Israelis, and we were convinced alongside them. So where this is going to fall, though, again, if you look at from the far left to the far right, it's going to fall squarely on Israel's lap as the country that, because, I mean, here's another part, talk about not bringing our allies on board. We didn't bring our own people on board during this campaign. The average American does not understand, and has no reason to understand because they're busy with the rest of their lives, what I just explained about Hezbollah being a direct threat to the American way of life, or Iran being a direct threat to the American way of life, not just through the nuclear weapons, but through this process of breaking American global power to the point where we are a minor power in a corner to whom they can dictate. And of course, that affects our way of life. I haven't seen an explanation by the administration to the American people why this war is necessary and why Iran poses a threat to us, not just to Israel. So the way this is going to be portrayed is this was a war for Israel. Look, the Israelis got bombed. This is their war, and we got dragged into it. And there's no American interest. And you're going to have the Tucker Carlsons from the right, and the AOCs from the left use this as grist for their mill to say, look, this is a bad ally. This is an ally that drags us into wars that that are not in our interests, that cost American lives. And they'll point to Iraq, even though official Israel at the time, the government of Ariel Sharon was opposed to the Iraq War, was opposed to the U.S. invasion of Iraq and deposing Saddam Hussein because they realized this is going to create reverberations in the region. They'll point to Bibi Netanyahu's testimony before Congress around the time to say, same man that led us into Iraq is the same man that led us into Iran now. So I think it's going to be a rough ride for Israel, given that, again, the objectives of this campaign have not been explained, and ultimately, we didn't succeed. We didn't succeed in achieving the ultimate objectives of this campaign.
Wow, that's a stark point by which to draw a close to our great conversation here, David. It's really appreciate having you on for the first time. Be very keen to have you and some of your fellow colleagues at FDD back, or for the first time, bring some of the new colleagues onto the show. A lot of food for thought there, and certainly it's going to be a rough ride, as you said. I'm going to continue on the stream now as we welcome our next guest, but I will be sure, as I say, to reach out to you in the next week or so. We can definitely have you back. Well, maybe in the next 24 hours, given what's happening and everything. But thanks so much for your time, David. Everyone, that was David from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C., an expert on Lebanon and Hezbollah. I'm sure you'll agree. And well, so much to say. I've never really been an expert on the intricacies of that dynamic. But I certainly learned a lot from him. I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but that's not the point. The show is to broaden our horizons and expose ourselves to uncomfortable truths or uncomfortable perspectives, which is what I've tried to do in the past couple of months, especially. And I see we're joined here by Amir Hajani, who is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and who we had on last week, I believe, when we had a bit of a sort of spontaneous three-way exchange, didn't we, Amir, with Daniel Boardman of the Daniel of the National Telegraph. But I did want to read a piece of information just before we get started, because it looks like Trump may have released a statement of some form. Now that I'm trying to find it, I can't find it. Obviously, that's how it works. But it looks like, yeah, he may have made some points. Let me just see here if I can find it. But Amir, I mean, just whilst we get started, really, a lot is moving today. We're seeing a lot of activity around Lebanon. Over 250 people have been killed. It's the biggest operation, or biggest such operation, Netanyahu has claimed since the Pyotr move, which took out Nasrallah in September of 24. So, I appreciate if you're not explicit and expert on Lebanon, on Hezbollah, but how do you look at that front in the broader context of what's happening with Iran and the US and ceasefire?
Well, I don't know if we even have a ceasefire anymore, because I think the White House is backtracking on the basis that Iran had agreed to ceasefire. Was you had two competing proposals. You had the 15-point plan that the White House sent over, which Iran rejected, and they put together a 10-point plan. President Trump, in his tweet yesterday announcing the ceasefire, he said the 10-point plan was the basis of the discussions that would take place between the United States and Iran. He sort of couched it in some other bombastic language, but he mentions the 10-point plan. Now the White House is saying that that plan is unserious and President Trump threw it in the garbage, and there's a new 10-point plan that President Trump was referring to. I'm not sure what that new 10-point plan is. The Iranian Speaker of the Parliament, who was supposed to be meeting with J.D. Vance on Friday in Islamabad, put out the 10-point plan on his tweet about an hour ago. One of the points in the plan, getting back to your question, was that all theaters, to include Lebanon, would stop fighting. So that would mean that Israel would stop its assault in Lebanon, and Hezbollah would stop fighting Israel, stop firing missiles into Israel. Obviously, that memo didn't get to Tel Aviv, because this morning they launched an onslaught on Beirut. And I think the Iranians have said, as well as there seems to be, I should say, parentheses to that as well, some attacks on Iranian energy installations in the Persian Gulf. Whether those attacks were by Israel or the UAE, still don't know. Both sides are claiming they didn't do it. But these are not the things that happen in a ceasefire, right?
Well, from my understanding, Israel wasn't involved in the original, the first any sort of noise that I heard about it was from one of the broadcasters, I think Channel 12 or something like that, stated that Israel had not been involved in the establishment of this ceasefire. So what is Netanyahu acting out of spite for this? Is he trying to derail this peace process, the ceasefire, because it's not within Israel's interest?
I think obviously I'm not Netanyahu's head, but I can sort of, what I can gather is fighting Lebanon and dropping bombs on Beirut are easier for him than dropping bombs in Tehran. Because if he drops bombs in Tehran, Tehran fires back. And also there's global geopolitical implications to that. Straits of Hormuz are shut down. Iran fires into the Gulf states' energy infrastructure. Iran has much greater reach to cause damage, not just to Israel, but to the global economy. And the whole world then points fingers at Israel saying, you're not abiding by this. With Lebanon, he can sort of drop as many bombs as Lebanon as he wants. And there's very little repercussions to the global community, right? Because Lebanon and Hezbollah don't control the Straits of Hormuz. They don't really control anything. So that's sort of the cost for him to doing that is much less than it would be to firing on to Iran. So I think from his perspective is, okay, I'll abide by Trump's ceasefire for Iran, but I'm not going to abide by it for Lebanon.
So how much though what's the objective here of Israel then? We just had David Dowd of the Foundation of Defense for Democracies, which is obviously going to be more hawkish and standing on a particular side of what's happening between Israel and Hezbollah, for example. But what is the, and I know you're not in his head, but like what, Netanyahu is trying to derail the relationship with him and Trump? Because I can't see this being a great decision for him. Trump's obviously gotten a bit exasperated. I see this as a repeat of the 12-day war, right? When they had the operations, the exchanges between Israel and Iran, and then eventually Netanyahu was able to persuade Trump to conduct Operation Midnight Hammer. And then after that, Trump's like, okay, I've had enough now of you, Netanyahu, like, leave me alone. I want to go back to focusing on Trump and on Putin and going to Alaska and, giving red carpets to a war criminal. Like, is this what he's trying to do again? Is he just trying to persuade Trump this is within your interests to keep the war going?
I think it's deeper than that. On the surface, it could be that. I think it looks at Israel. Israel's failed strategically in its objective. It sold Trump on a vision of regime change within a week or two, sort of decapitation of the senior leadership, fragmentation of Iran at low cost, and Iran wouldn't control the Straits. None of that happened. Yes, Iran took blows, but Iran comes out of this, even if this ceasefire is broken, by the way. Iran, the real nuclear option for Iran isn't the enriched uranium. It's the Straits of Hormuz. That's their insurance policy, right? That's what they've gained from this war. And I think for Israel, this was his last gasp to find, essentially, I hate to say it, a stooge like Trump who went along with this sort of cockamamie scheme that for the last 47 years, other presidents said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We know you want to do that. We're not going to do that. Because they knew that this would be the repercussions. Right.
So I think it's interesting because just again, as an example, David earlier was equally critical that the decapitation strategy by Israel and America has not been successfully carried out. I made this point. I'll just lay it out again for you, and you can, pick it apart if you want. But, an effective decapitation strategy means the political leadership is taken out, but not just the political leadership. You've got to reduce them. You've got to remove the military system. You've got to remove the security forces, the police, etc., law enforcement, and you've got to remove the judicial system, right? You've got to effectively incapacitate all of those elements, and they haven't done that. And so Israel is like, well, we haven't done that with, we've sort of done that with IRGC, or we've sort of done that with the Islamic Republic, but now we're going to go after Hezbollah as well, in a country that's already been on the receiving end of what?
I think Israel they think that Iran is Hezbollah or Hamas. Iran's a nation state with depth and 92 million people. And it has a government and a military apparatus that is many, many layers deep. This isn't taking Nasrallah out or taking the supreme leader out. In fact, I would argue taking the supreme leader out, actually, he was a restraining factor on it. Once he was gone, and the leadership, the aging leadership of the IRGC that was taken out in the first week of the war, the young guns, the young Turks have come into play. And these guys are itching for a fight with Israel. They didn't want a ceasefire in the 12-day war. I'm not sure they want a ceasefire now, because they feel that they can hammer Israel. That they feel that Iran can take those blows and keep firing back. And I would argue that if the ceasefire is broken or doesn't hold, which I don't think it will, over time, Israel's going to run out of interceptors. The damage to Israel is going to be so much greater than what it's been over the last month. And I think that's what this young cadre of zealous IRGC generals want. They want to show the world and Israel that they can do this kind of damage to Israel. So I think this is something that, you know, the FDDs and the UANIs, well, we could just take these guys out, and it doesn't. I don't think that analysis is proven faulty and wrong, right? Mowing the lawn in Hezbollah and Hamas is much different than Iran, you know, with its geography and population. You know,
well, you know. No, I mean, look, I'm very conscious of what Lebanon has been through in the past few years. Now, people from those institutions, communities, you know, that you've referenced, might well argue that this is a necessity, or that Lebanon has had time to deal with Hezbollah on its own. But they never did. And so Israel, because of its need to protect itself, the existential threat, these sorts of points the IDF may well frame, they have to do it. Do you think that that's a weak argument? Do you think that the Israelis, that Lebanon can't have done anything against Hezbollah?
Well, I'm 49 years old.
Most of my life, 30, Amir.
Most of my life, Israel's been invading Lebanon, right? Most of my life, Israel's had airstrikes in Lebanon. Every time that this happens, over time, Hezbollah wears down Israel. In 2000, after 18, 19 years, they packed up and left. They started again after. And by the way, I'm not saying that they're wrong about their analysis of Hezbollah, you know, but Hezbollah made a tragic error after the Hamas October 7th tragedy, launching missiles into Israel. You know, that proved to be, you know, unwise. That being said, Israel thought that, okay, we took care of Hezbollah afterwards and Nasrallah. It seems not to be the case. They regrouped. And they're going to continue to regroup because they're always going to resist. No matter what Israel does in Hezbollah, and no matter what Israel does in Lebanon, there's going to be this resistance force in Lebanon that builds back up again and pushes back. And so Israel's going to be in a quagmire in Lebanon, as they've always been. They've always been in this quagmire in Lebanon. They're going to get bled. They're going to bleed there like they've been bleeding for the last 40 years in Lebanon. Israel, by the way, hasn't finished off Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is still in control of the core areas of Gaza. So, you know, I think on all these fronts, yes, they've had military success. They've weakened these organizations, but at great costs, and I don't think they've achieved their strategic objectives.
Yeah, I mean, again, I asked this question to a couple of other people in the past days, and it's obviously something that I think a lot of people are concerned about, which is, territorial acquisition or unintended or intended occupation, right? In international law, you have that concept of belligerent occupancy. And in the case of Syria, the Golan Heights have been occupied for the best part of 60 years almost. And then when HTS took back took control over Syria, ousted Assad, as a precaution, the IDF, the Israeli government, they love to utilize the framing of preemptive action, right? Preemptive defense, preemptive deterrence. They preemptively extended the buffer zone of the Golan Heights to mitigate against what they perceived as military threats from Al-Qaeda or other jihadists in southwest Syria. Since then, clearly that hasn't happened. Not saying it couldn't, but the immediate threat or perceived threat in Syria hasn't materialized, but they haven't left the buffer zone. And so now they control a huge swathe of southern Lebanon up to the Libani River or whatever. And
I don't think they control it up to the Litani River. They're trying to control it.
Okay, but the point is that they will try to control it and then they'll try to occupy it. And therefore they will never leave, right? That's what some people worry or assume that this ultra-nationalist government is really about. Do you think that, or it's?
I don't think that's. I mean, if you listen to the IDF, the head of the IDF, and the chief of the general staff, they've said that the Israeli military is exhausted. He said last week. He said there's 10 red flags. They're overstretched. The Israeli society has gone through a lot of trauma, not just trauma because of October 7th, but everything that's happened since October 7th. I mean, they've spent the last month in bomb shelters for these missiles coming in from Iran. Their way of life, has been severely disrupted. I'm not sure that they're going to try. They may try to occupy southern Lebanon, the same way the United States tried to, push up in Vietnam. But over time, and Afghanistan. And Iraq, over time, we have a saying in American sports: the home team has an advantage if you play on their turf. The same thing.
It's not a strictly American term. That's what I have written.
In the pitch in the UK, when you guys in the Premiership, right?
Yeah.
You're playing at Old Trafford.
Okay, that's revealing who you support. Okay, Old Trafford. Okay, interesting. Anyway,
same thing in when it comes to geopolitics and warfare. The Lebanese, whether it's Hezbollah, Lebanon, in the south, they're going to fight for their land, and they're going to fight the occupier. They're not going to just lay down. Over time, they'll bleed them. That's what they did, from 1982 to 2001. Incidentally, it was Netanyahu who took Israel out of Lebanon right before 9/11. So I just don't see it as a winning strategy for that. It may be effective right now in killing a lot of Lebanese and scaring Hezbollah or intimidating Hezbollah, but I don't think in the long run it's going to be effective, because in the long run, occupation is never really effective.
So let's briefly shift to the ceasefire more broadly, right? There's a lot of claims I've just seen on X here. JD Vance, who was apparently critical in the final push to get this ceasefire over the hill. He's repeated the same statement earlier today that the Strait of Hormuz has seen an increase in traffic, despite all maritime tracking outlets reporting Wednesday has seen the lowest number of ships crossing the strait in April, right? So that, I think, is a good symbolism of the divergence, if you like, or just sheer contrasting rhetoric coming out of Tehran, coming out of DC, let alone obviously Tel Aviv, if we want to include them. But, has, in your opinion, the ceasefire been violated? If so, are we going to see a return to what we've seen over the past 6 weeks? Because in theory, America's really the only power that's not been violating it. The Iranians have shot stuff. The UAE used mirages against Iran, it turns out now. Where's this going? What's going on?
I don't mean to give you a lawyerly answer, but I'm going to have to. I don't know, because I don't know what's been agreed to, and I don't know what the source document they're referring to is, right? Iran refers to its 10 points. Up until yesterday, Trump had said that that was the basis, and many of the points have been agreed to. Now the White House is saying that those weren't the 10 points that Trump was talking about. There's a new set of 10 points. So we can't agree on which facts. We can't agree on the facts. Add a layer to that, which gives you the sort of the strangeness, if you will, of the times that we're in. We're living in a disinformation space, right? Everyone, it seems like Iran has Iran, the United States, the president, Israel are operating on their own set of facts, which they either perceive to be true, correctly or incorrectly, but then also rely on that, on their perception of those facts, to conduct warfare. So this is a very, very different world that we're in right now, because everyone is saying, no, that's not true. Here's what is true. So, and we're not able to sort of, it's hard to unpack that and point a finger and say the US or Israel or Iran violated the ceasefire, because I'm not sure that the three of them agree on what the ceasefire is.
But this is the thing, and even I can see in the audience's reaction here that Lebanon was explicitly mentioned in the peace proposals, and actually let's take a further step back, right? We've had the 15-point plan from Trump and the 10-point proposal. I'm just calling those distinctions from Iran, and so which blueprint are we using? I incorrectly, I think at one point, thought that the primary blueprint was the 10-point plan, but it turns out that no, it was actually a combination of both to an extent. But one explicitly referenced Lebanon in point number one. Yemen, Lebanon, and Iraq are to see a cessation of hostilities, right? Then point two is a cessation of hostilities to do with whatever. And then the third one is around the whole conflict. They're all sort of basically the same point, cessation of hostilities in the Middle East, right, across all fronts. But the Trump administration and people in the comments here are saying that Lebanon was never explicitly mentioned. And the Trump administration have subsequently, in the past hours, shifted their position from agreeing with the Pakistani mediators to, no, actually, Israel's correct. Lebanon was never part of it.
Right. So this is that's why I'm saying we're operating on, each party is operating on a different set of facts. And I think they're operating on a different set of facts that suits their agenda of how things should go forward. For Iran, Lebanon, it's right up there, as you said. Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. Cessation of hostilities on all fronts, right? But the Trump administration, Israel saying, no, that was, that's not what's agreed to. So until, and that's why I don't know if there is going to be in the next hour, and maybe in the next minutes after we're done, the ceasefire could be violated. Iran could be shooting missiles again toward Tel Aviv, or vice versa. So I think it's very tenuous. I'm not sure it's going to hold for the full 2 weeks. I don't think Israel is going to abide by it, and I don't think if Israel doesn't abide by it, Iran will abide by it. I don't think that President Trump or the U.S. are able to restrain Israel. And so I think that, we're going to be right back to where we were yesterday.
You think we're going to go back to the war that we've just had for the past 6-7 weeks?
I think there could be periods in the next 2 weeks or 2 months that we could have that type of hostility break out again. Yes, I do.
But at the same intensity, continuity.
Well, has it stopped? Has it stopped today? I mean, Beirut got, blitzed in a way that had not been. I don't even think it was blitzed like that during a year and a half ago when they took out Nasrallah.
No, I know, but people argue that Lebanon is a separate entity, and therefore, the war between Iran and the US can be some sort of resolved, quote unquote, whilst Israel continues with what's happening in Lebanon, right?
But then this morning, critical energy infrastructure in the Persian Gulf, Iran's infrastructure in the Persian Gulf, the refineries were hit. Whether it was Israel, whether it was the UAE, we don't know. It wasn't the U.S. I don't. For the ceasefire to hold, all the parties have to agree on a set of facts, and I'm not sure that we're there yet.
Well, the reason why I'm sort of, I'm coming at it from this angle for this part of the conversation is because, the Iranians and Americans are going to be meeting. That it seems that despite whatever's happening on whoever it is side to continue the strikes or military action, let's just use a broader term, they still are intent on meeting. So are we going to be living in a situation where we've got the military operations happening alongside the diplomatic dialogue, which is effectively what we saw before February 28th when Trump discontinued the negotiations? There were pockets of flare-ups here and then, Lebanon being one of the biggest, but the two sides were engaged in dialogue. So are we just returning to what was before, except 6 weeks of complete destruction?
In both times they were negotiating, Iran and the United States, over the summer and this past winter. In the middle of the negotiations, Israel and the United States attacked Iran. So it's very possible that there could be negotiations tomorrow in Islamabad, and there could be attacks on Monday, Sunday, or Tuesday. There's still troop deployment going into the Persian Gulf. There's still heavy American footprint in the region. So I don't buy this notion that it's just contained to the Lebanon Israel theater, and Iran and the U.S. are going to work it out. I don't buy that. I hope that that's what happens. I hope they do work it out, because you don't want to see any more violence and more destruction. But it's very tenuous, and I think that odds are it will not work out, and we will be back to where we were.
That's not what we like to hear, is it, Amir? We want to see a drawdown of this, but I want to thank you so much for coming back on. It's been a great chat. I'm sure we'll grab you back on later on in the week if you've got time. There's more to discuss. Maybe we can, dissect what comes out of the peace talks. If anything, it's Wednesday, April 8th. They're supposed to happen on April 10th. Someone mentioned Saturday now. It just still seems to be being made up as we go along. But yeah. Thank you very much for your time, Amir. I'm going to just sort of debrief and summarize because we've had a mammoth stream today of about 3 hours. So I'm just going to sort of summarize, but I'll definitely be sure to have you back on very soon. And thanks so much for your time. That's Amir Hajani, everyone, non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and who we've had on the show before. Really, I think, speaking more bluntly, then perhaps we've had quite a diverse array of guests this afternoon. What I'm probably going to do is also, guys, start these streams slightly later. It's a bit of a balancing act for me because I'm in the UK, and so obviously a lot of you are from the US or whatever. So I want to ensure that some of you can join the streams, but also I want to be sure that I'm not streaming at 2 o'clock in the bloody morning as I was yesterday. And for some reason, my partner, who's probably looking at me now rather sort of somehow is still with me. So I still want to maintain my romantic love life as much as my also streaming life. So anyway, jokes aside, I'm probably going to start the stream slightly later if you guys, if that works for you, such as sort of like, 8, 9 p.m. UK time. So that's probably like 4, 5 Eastern Standard Time. Probably start from there, unless you've got a special guest you can't manage with that. But the point is that we had a large array of guests today, starting with Samantha Gross of the Brookings Institute, and she I took a pretty pragmatic, cold hard look at the situation. That was followed up by David Daoud, who was the expert on Lebanon and Hezbollah from the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, and is obviously was quite forthright on his perspective. But I also think fairly reasonable in his criticisms or shortcomings of Israel. And then we were joined lastly by Amir Hajani, who obviously spoke much more probably on the other side. And so we've had the full spectrum, someone pretty central, pragmatic, policy focused, and then we've had someone who's more about critical of Israel, the US, and one who's more not free of criticism of the US, but more sort of saying that we need to try to deal hawkish and dovish is what people emphasize, I think. But anyway, for me, I think the situation, I think the ceasefire is going to hold. I do think that it's going to continue, albeit you're going to see pockets of violations. Lebanon is not a pocket of violation. It's another incomplete war front. But I'm talking in the context of Iran and the US. I do think that both sides are quite intent on seeing a drawdown and a secession, a sustained secession, because despite the disruptions, despite the rhetoric we've seen coming out of the internet over the past few hours, both are pushing ahead with, going ahead with the talks. The delegations are being announced, the timings are being announced, they're making plans around that, and they wouldn't be bothering with that if you didn't have any intention to meet them. So, that's one good element, I guess, or that's something to keep a look on. But then, of course, the other element in all of this is either the Strait of Hormuz itself and Lebanon itself. The Strait of Hormuz is I'm just going to use the phrase because I think it's funny, but a clusterfuck of misinformation and fog. No one has any idea really how many, they're claiming that the Strait of Hormuz is completely open, but the hard data from like S&P Global and these other sort of intelligence business related firm, whatever organizations are emphasizing that it's closed, or that a minimal amount of ships have come through. I'm just going to read you an update here because it leads me into the final point, which is Lebanon. Mohsen Rezai, senior Iranian official. I'm not pretending to be a local guy to pronounce it correctly. But anyway, senior Iranian official has an advisor to Mujtaba, the supreme leader, has said, quote, "We stand with all our might alongside the Hezbollah Mujahideen, and we will punish Israel." Interesting. So they explicitly distinguish Israel. The responsibility for the collapse of the ceasefire lies with America. Oh, okay. I shouldn't have preempted that. Sorry, everybody. But, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to latch on to sort of hope that it's not collapsing. But, we will punish Israel. They don't say they will punish America. They're sort of blaming America for the ceasefire's situation. But are they going to respond only to Israel and not to America? Maybe I'm overreading in that, but the bottom line is this then also leads to the third major component that's happening right now, which is Lebanon. 250 people have been killed, 1,100 have been injured in the worst attacks today since the pager of and the ousting of the network as it was in the late 24th. So Lebanon is suffering most of all now, even more than Iran, you could argue, because it's been a failing state for years. The government has never really been able to get on top of the situation of the economy, let alone just Hezbollah. And compared to Iran, Lebanon doesn't have a functioning institutional framework. It doesn't have a functioning government as much. So I severely worry about the extent of the Lebanon front. I think that's what we're going to be focusing on intermittently as alongside following the peace talks and developments around the Strait of Hormuz. But everyone, that's it for me. I'm going to go and watch Trump fail to try to withdraw from NATO with high amusement, because as we know, he can't do that. He has to seek 2/3 congressional approval from Congress under the NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act. So what he can do, well, he can diminish belief in Article 5 and that the Americans will follow through in supporting their allies. And he can, physically reduce American presence in theory. But I think that's a logistically very complicated thing to do. But he may attempt to do it in some form. So anyway, guys, thanks a lot for your time. We'll be back tomorrow for a couple of hours, maybe one. I'm not sure. Just trying to get guests together. Yeah, do subscribe. Do like the videos. Subscribe to the other 2 channels if you haven't already. Maybe buy me a coffee to help me wake up in the mornings because I go to bed pretty late. But anyway, take it easy, guys.